Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that masterpiece known as Deja Vu. Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that masterpiece known as Deja Vu. Did we already? Nah.
It's great.
On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit as C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and... I'm sorry, there's some weird, laser point thing. No, it's probably nothing. I don't know what that is, but it probably won't mean anything, especially in the next 4 or so days.
Oh, hello. I am Bryan, and I've got my reading glasses on and everything.
Well, we're not the only ones here, Bryan, because we have a very special guest with us here. He's a buddy of mine. You might remember if you've listened to any of the Double Edge Double Bill stuff. He appeared on multiple episodes of that show. And he's just coming in his best dad fit with, his hands over his mouth as he's walking up to us with his sunglasses. It is Yonathan Habtemichael. Yonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Thomas. It's been great and nice to finally actually record with Bryan. I now can see the wreckage of an exploded ferry. It just keeps happening, just like Oklahoma City.
Yep, just like Oklahoma City, yes. But, Yonathan, I wanted to have you on because we've been friends for a while, and I know that you're a big sci-fi person. We've been kind of discussing this over the course of this particular season about the concept of hard sci-fi. What does hard sci-fi mean to you?
I look at hard sci-fi as an exploration of actual science that is either today or coming out in the very near future, and film actually trying to focus on what works and having that be integrated into the story or the themes. Like, what I think the difference between hard and soft sci-fi is soft sci-fi could take some of the concepts that you could see in hard sci-fi, but gloss over details, maybe get a few things wrong, but they still want to make a good story, while hard sci-fi wants you to learn. And I think that is the key difference. And I know there's been all the back and forth with Star Wars. Is it science fiction? Is it science fantasy? I think it's just easier to just put it in its own category because it just does whatever it wants. People complain about gravity not working in Star Wars or fire and explosions, hearing sound. Like back then, because this is all based on pulp stuff, it didn't matter. They just wanted to see spaceships and lasers. And that's kind of why I feel like hard sci-fi is a subgenre that can actually get people interested in science in a way that I think science documentaries can be too dry. And right. I think that might be it. Yeah. And that could be also a pitfall with a lot of prominent hard sci-fi films where they go into that meticulous route, but they become so meticulous that it just becomes boring. And that's kind of the problem, I would say. If you're fiction or fantasy, you still need to have something that's strange and new, but actually captivate the audience.
Yeah, I mean, especially with, what we're talking about today, where with, our season so far, we've covered the Andromeda Strain, which was a bit more of hard sci-fi, but specifically more about extraterrestrial kind of leavings, basically, a virus that's sort of come back from outer space. And High Life is a bit more space exploration. Crimes of the Future kind of has this weird kind of human evolution in the wake of a dystopia. iRobot, very much based on obviously androids and robotics and whatnot, artificial intelligence. But this time we're talking about Deja Vu for our M for Masterpiece for Hard Sci-Fi. And this one deals more with time travel, which I would argue, out of all those different things we've already covered, time travel seems like potentially the least plausible possible thing to actually be possible in any kind of even vaguely realistic hard sci-fi sense.
Definitely. I think on paper you could see this and just blow it off as a soft sci-fi or even fantasy idea. But I do think that with at least how they go about explaining how this window works, there's at least a level of understanding the quantum mechanics and how astrophysics works on a level that is not fully understood, especially for a 2006 audience, that it fits enough that you don't feel like you just had someone just give you bullshit. Because also you're following Denzel Washington, and he already smells the bullshit that they give to him to explain how it all works.
And he'll sniff it like he's sniffing that glass in front of Jim Caviezel.
Oh yeah.
Oh god. But Bryan, what about you? How do you feel about especially hard sci-fi in relation to like a time travel plot? Do you feel like that kind of stretches the plausibility of hard sci-fi a bit more than the other concepts we've covered so far this season?
I think that time travel is the one kind of if you want to kind of like split it up into like space sci-fi and human evolution sci-fi and just kind of or diseases and stuff like that. Like time travel feels like the one sort of sci-fi trope or idea or whatever that I think it definitely can be the most glossed over, right? Like you don't need to explain that much with time travel, and there is, because obviously it is such a like, at least currently, like implausible thing, you can kind of mess around with the logic of it. There's different like theories you can do. Like this movie is very different to like the theory in like, I don't know, Back to the Future or whatever, which is different from like Avengers Endgame or whatever. I think different movies treat time travel very differently. You get like a Bill and Ted, for instance, which is like the silliest example I can think of, where like, right, yeah, just hang out with Socrates and Abraham Lincoln or whatever.
But they even explain this kind of sci-fi aesthetic of that, where there's a whole thing like, remember, in order for us to get the keys, we have to leave the keys behind, so don't forget to put them back.
God. Oh, maybe we should cover Bill and Ted. That's a real masterpiece there.
And very hard sci-fi, very realistic and grounded.
Or you can have like, I think we've talked about this movie on this series. We've mentioned it. Hopefully this is the last time we'll mention it, but it bears repeating that like Primer is a movie that is very steeped in the science of time travel and how it actually works and all this stuff. I was thinking about Primer after I watched this movie and a movie I'm going to talk about later, but just my problem with Primer, apart from the fact that Shane Carruth is a piece of shit now, is the fact that like, as much as I love the fact that Primer is really, really, really cares about all of the scientific elements of it, what that movie forgets to do is have an interesting narrative, which I think you really need for any science fiction movie, right? Like you just need a good narrative like this movie. And so for me, I think like time travel, it is such a difficult thing to do because you can make a time travel movie, but then like a couple decades later, scientists might come around and be like, okay, actually, yeah, that wouldn't work because this, and this, right? It seems like something that, we can kind of prove with real science a lot more tangibly than we can like laser blasters and robots or whatever. I'm glad we picked this movie for a time travel movie because it does feel like it has a real grasp of how it wants to depict this stuff, and it doesn't get like too deep into how it actually works, but it gets deep enough to where you understand how it works as entertainment, but also you understand how this device works from a kind of quasi-scientific perspective, which I really loved and I think is really great about this movie. But yeah, what about you? How do you feel about kind of time travel and kind of how some more hard sci-fi movies tend to handle time travel as a concept?
Well, I mean, it's kind of rough to have like other hard sci-fi kind of comparisons beyond. Like, I agree with you that the closest is something like a Primer in terms of how grounded that movie kind of treats the idea of like its time travel. But I think honestly, I just prefer time travel in more of like the context of, say, like Back to the Future 2 has that one scene where Doc explains the basic idea of like what this movie also does about just like when you do this particular event, it creates another rift in the time vortex or whatever. And it's like it has it on a blackboard, and he just like explains it in very basic terms. With time travel, like people get so hung up on like the rules of time travel, and it's like, one, it's not a fucking like plausible thing. Really, guys. Like, it's not fucking plausible. The most realistic time travel you do is when you go to sleep at night and you wake up and it's 8 hours later. That's the closest you're gonna fucking get
8 hours.
to like
Look
a
at
time
this
travel
fucking guy.
Hey,
Yeah, I totally sleep 8 hours completely. But I think that's the thing, is that like time travel is so like unrealistic as a concept that it's like, I don't know, if you give me like a very basic thing, like something, like do that, or the Event Horizon thing, which this movie also kind of does, of like bend the paper in half and you could go through it. Like,
Right.
it does everything but use the pen basically for that. I don't necessarily need like an elaborate explanation. This movie does, like you mentioned, like the most it does with like its characters to like kind of explain all this, but still keeps like the kind of central sort of thing with say Denzel's character very prominent. It's just like, yeah, whatever. How about I explain this to all you with PhDs in the room, and then destroying that monitor and explaining it like that way. I think that's the better way to go about it. Is like you can have like whatever kind of concept that fits your reality, but then just kind of like, I don't know, have an interesting story around that. So the time travel rules don't really distract. Like, there are technically holes in Deja Vu for like the time travel or whatever, but I don't really give a shit because the movie's, spoilers, incredibly entertaining, so it doesn't really fucking matter. I don't care. It's fine.
yeah, I think the big difference that people should not focus on in time travel stories is the difference between a paradox and a plot hole. I honestly think that, yes, if you're going to complain about, because you mentioned Back to the Future Part 2, where Biff comes back to the normal 2015 after giving the almanac to his younger self. If that were to happen, he would not have gone back to his original future. Like, that kind of thing is like a plot hole, but it messes with the story if you can't have him bring the DeLorean back. But there are a lot of stories that just have paradoxes where you see that one thing happened one way, then the person goes back and then changes it, and then there's a whole other set of questions on how can the stuff that happens once that person has time traveled still have some of the things that happened in the first loop occurred the same way. That's kind of okay. Like, I think you shouldn't be so hung up because, as you said, this is about the story, and you can have any sort of rules that, as long as you're consistent enough that it doesn't mess with the actual narrative. Because like even in the scene where when Denzel is talking with all of the PhDs, like saying like they have their own theories on what would happen if you were to change the past. Because there's, I mean, we'll go more in detail, but the idea of there's a lot of inevitability that's already happening, especially because you're aware of the past because it's history. It's going to have to take a lot of drastic changes to actually make something shift. And then that doesn't even say that, it doesn't even explain what happens to the old line, because that timeline could still exist. It could branch off into other things, or it can cease to exist. I think that allows that kind of speculative fiction, at least, is allowable in a hard sci-fi story because there's not a hard set answer, and they're not trying to get a hard set answer. I mean, there might be some examples that we'll talk about at the end that maybe are a little bit like that, but I think at least for Deja Vu, there's enough leeway that you can still enjoy the idea of a time travel story while having some real science behind it.
Well, and that Back to the Future 2 comparison you just brought up, like that scene with Biff, is actually interesting because if you're a dork like me, you've seen the deleted scene from that movie, in which, like, if you watch Back to the Future 2, you notice that, like, old Biff seems like he's having a heart attack, basically, as he's leaving the DeLorean, and then he just disappears off screen, we don't see him again. But in the deleted scene, after, like, Doc and Marty go back into the DeLorean and, like, travel back to, like, 1985, that'll be affected by Biff, you would have seen in this deleted scene, like, old Biff disappear. Like, he watches them leave, and then he, like, disappears like they do in Back to the Future, just, like, fades away. Which was apparently explained by, like, oh, yeah, like, in this future, like Leah Thompson would have ended up killing him at some point in the 90s, basically. But when they screened that particular scene, everyone in the audience was like, wait, why did that happen? Why did he disappear? So they're like, oh, we have kind of an explanation, but it kind of dissipates from the actual narrative and the investment people had in the story, so fuck it. We don't want to actually explain this. It's fine, whatever. He came back, it's cool. So we can have the time machine go in 1985 in the alternate timeline. Whatever, doesn't matter. It's fine.
Zemeckis made his choice.
Well, in any case, you know what? Let's just get into the movie. We kind of referenced it a bit more. Let's dive deep into Deja Vu.
It's a phenomenon known as Deja Vu. It's a phenomenon known as Deja Vu. You arrive at a place you've never been, but it feels familiar. You look into the face of a stranger, and you feel like you've known her all your life.
Have we met?
Yeah. Yeah, we have.
Deja vu is believed by many to be a trick of the mind, but the truth is far more extraordinary.
What if you had to tell someone the most important thing in the world, but you knew they'd never believe you?
I tried.
Deja vu. If you think it's just a feeling, go back and look again.
So, Deja Vu came out November 22nd, 2006, from director Tony Scott. This is our first Tony Scott movie we've covered on the show, and, I mean, Tony Scott's a fascinating figure where, if you don't know, he was very prominent in the 80s through the 90s into the 2000s, tragically passed away in 2012, and it's been so interesting seeing, like, posts, especially his tragic passing, him go from, like, a guy who, when he was releasing movies at the time, was often just considered, like, oh, he makes an effective kind of junky, action movie or whatever, and nowadays, that kind of, like, 10 years plus since his passing, he has become this celebrated auteur amongst film fans. When I was younger, like, I only really watched stuff like, his Beverly Hills Cop 2, or Top Gun, some of the more, like, famous ones that I also would say are kind of, like, on the lower edge of his list. But going back and, like, seeing, like, all of his other things as I've done over the course of, like, the last, decade or so, it is truly a case of, like, something, we often say this, and this kind of sentiment of, like, oh, man, things were so much better back in the day can often feel very, like, nostalgic-y and dumb. But for someone like Tony Scott, it's truly a case of, like, looking back at his filmography, we didn't know how fucking good we had it with goddamn Tony Scott making movies. I know, Bryan, you recently went through all of his movies, like, a couple years ago, and would you agree with that sentiment? Are you a fan of Mr. Scott?
Yeah, I'm a huge Tony Scott fan. I went back and watched all of his movies. I think last year, because I had only seen Top Gun, which it's funny because that's a movie I refused to watch for, like, years, because someone I went to high school with, like, loved that movie and was, like, would always talk about it, but I hated them and they were, like, super annoying and whatever, and so I just never watched Top Gun until the new one came out. I really do love Tony Scott. I think what you said is true. I think you don't appreciate just how great his films are, but how, like, we talk about this a lot, how movies nowadays, like, they're still great movies, they're still great looking movies, but generally I think movies have this blandness and this grayness that, of course, is, like, part of it is due to, like, digital filmmaking and just kind of the flat look that digital has. And in that regard, I think you really do miss someone like Tony Scott, who could make anything look like the most cinematic thing in the world is happening. He is such a hot, stylish filmmaker in a way where, yeah, it's funny you mentioned, like, Top Gun, which is, like, really stylish, but then I think going into a lot of those 2000s ones where his style becomes a lot more frenetic, he starts using, like, multi-cameras, right? Like, I think they, like, there's, like, a nickname for him was, like, 5-camera Tony or something like that. Like, right. The way he just would shoot with different cameras and just his freneticism is something that you really, really miss. And something I really miss about him as well as he got into the 2000s is his movies became a lot more concerned with modern ideas and with the modern world. You know, you see it a lot in like Enemy of the State, which is like a really like prescient thriller about like surveillance and, you know, I mean, feels really, really, really like it predicted a lot of what, you know, the world is like today. And even something like Deja Vu, which, you know, we'll talk about again. But to see someone this late into his career who's already made like, you know, his huge hits like Top Gun and Days of Thunder and Last Boy Scout and True Romance, just to see him kind of evolve his style and become, you know, more modern, more frenetic, more kind of hyper stylized into the 2000s. It's really great to watch as you go through his career. And he has very few kind of misses, you know, like I would say something like Revenge, the Kevin Costner movie, is kind of a miss. It kind of doesn't exist. But even a movie like The Fan, the movie with Robert De Niro and Wesley Snipes, is a pretty great movie. I think it is a, you know, it kind of doesn't exist, but it's a lot of fun. And yeah, I too have kind of I have this newfound appreciation for Tony Scott. And yeah, it is really just tragic that he couldn't make more movies, especially because I love him right to the end. I think Unstoppable is a really phenomenal movie.
I think it's because Tony Scott in the 90s really was kind of like just this big action movie director that he almost fell into a state of where he was just kind of considered like a basic cable movie director, just making movies that dads would just like to watch. I
Right.
think what really brought him to my scope really was Man on Fire, because it really felt like with Denzel Washington basically like doing Death Wish, but like in a such more stylized way. Just it finally actually clicked. Just putting it on the radar, because I felt like everything that I associated with auteurism really was more to his brother Ridley, and like he was in like Gladiator, Alien, all that stuff. Like it just felt like Tony was more and more just being stuck in like the same category as Michael Bay. And I think once we get into like like into his later movies, like we're talking about like Deja Vu through Unstoppable, like that's when I think I took more notice, because of like the color theory. Like it's been forever since I've seen Deja Vu. Like rewatching, like it looks gorgeous just on how we have actual color in movies. Like, oh my God. At the beginning of the movie, the whole disaster is like mid-morning. It still looks like magic hour. It looks gorgeous. Like it's not like how, like I said, like another contemporary Michael Bay. It doesn't look like it's just a plain gold. Like you actually see like the sun. You have like interiors of buildings actually have like different shades of blues and greens. Like it's something that should stick. I literally said like I talk about him being like a basic cable director. I saw like a snippet of Taking a Pelham 1-2-3. It looks good. I don't think it's a good movie, but at least it's engrossing enough, just on a visual scale, even if it has John Travolta just hamming it up. Like, oh my God.
It is one of, I think, the better Denzel performances, though, in that movie, where he gets to be kind of more of just like a normal guy, you know, because I think we're so used to Denzel being this like authoritative figure, right? Like you buy anything he is giving you. And in that movie, he's a bit more kind of normal and just kind of like unsure and kind of, I don't know. It's a great Denzel performance, even if John Travolta is a bit much.
Right, it's him embracing kind of the Walter Matthauisms of his character, given it's a remake of that particular movie. But I guess, yeah, we should note that Tony Scott and Denzel Washington collaborated many times. For a while, he was the guy that Denzel Washington collaborated with the most, because he had previously been in Crimson Tide and Man on Fire before this, and after this he would do Taking a Pelham 1-2-3 and Unstoppable. And the only people to kind of match up to him in terms of collaborations are now Antoine Fuqua, who he's collaborated with quite a bit, and soon Spike Lee will tie that as well, with the new Higher and Lower coming soon, which will be their fifth collaboration. And yeah, let's we gotta dive into Denzel. here for sure. I mean, obviously, the star of this movie, amazing. Jonathan, I'm curious, what's your history with Denzel then?
Oh, that has to be somewhere in the 90s because, like, what I like about Denzel Washington is as a uh, prominent actor, he can be in almost any type of movie that you would just assume a movie star would be in the late 80s to the early 2000s. He can do action, he can do drama, and he can just do historical films that you would watch in high school and they would just edit out the cursing. Like, he is such a versatile actor and so affable that you could just watch any movie just because it's Denzel Washington. I remember as like a 10-year-old, I seen the commercial for Virtuosity, thing like Denzel Washington's finding a computer virus serial killer. I gotta check that out. And it was one of the worst mistakes I ever made.
It's so funny that's Denzel's like other sci-fi movie is fucking Virtuosity, which I don't know if you know what that is, Bryan, but it's like a movie in which Denzel has to fight Russell Crowe, who's like an evil computer virus program guy, basically.
Okay, sounds cool.
He's
It
basically
sounds
playing
cool.
it like he's the Joker. It's so
Yeah.
fucking weird. But yeah, I mean, I remember when I was younger, my first glimpse of Denzel was definitely Remember the Titans. I remember seeing that not just in the theater when it originally came out, but every subsequent year at some point in school. When teachers were like at the end of the year and didn't give a shit, just like, yeah, we'll put on Remember the Titans, which I revisited for the first time in like forever recently. And that's kind of like a perfect introductory Denzel movie, where that movie has a lot of, problems. It might shock you, but it has a very simplistic view on resolving race relations. this football movie from Disney might be a bit simplistic on that front. But he is just immediate. Like, I remember very distinctly when I was a kid, the moment where all the guys are like getting onto the buses, and he goes up to like Ryan Hurst and his buddy and talks about like, oh, like Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis. Hey, everybody, listen up. This is Jerry. He does the jokes, and Dean sings the songs and gets the girl. Everyone have a big hand for him, and he really commits to clapping, and no one else is. It's just a super awkward moment of him completely dressing them down. And I just remember being instantly like, this guy is both incredibly scary, but also incredibly charismatic and charming. He has that intimidation, but he's also just like, I want to get his approval. I want Daddy Denzel to love me.
Oh, yes.
And...
Yeah. Yeah, that's the point where he's Daddy Denzel instead of his current uncle Denzel, which ain't that bad. But
no, look, I recently watched The Third Equalizer earlier today. It's kind of like partial prep. And like those movies, Antoine Fuqua isn't my favorite director, but those movies are so perfect for Denzel in terms of just having like that fucking movie where he just spends most of it just like, oh, I'm hanging around Sicily. All these Italian people are like, oh, buongiorno. Oh, here's your tea, Denzel. And he's like, grazie. Oh no, the mafia's fucking with you. I'm gonna go Jason Voorhees on these motherfuckers, and then go back to saying ciao. Oh, lovely, mamma mia. Exactly what I want out of Denzel.
God, and the thing about those Equalizer movies as well is like, like Antoine Fuqua is not a great director in my opinion. It's very weird that they've collaborated like so many times. Although it's nice that they liked working together and whatever. But he is one of the most charismatic actors of all time, maybe. And in those Equalizer movies, it is just him carrying the entire movie by his performance. You're going to watch him, like, fuck these people up. Like, yeah, I rewatched the first Equalizer a few months ago, and I was just, like, gleefully waiting, like, he's going to fucking kill all these people, and it's going to be so fucking cool.
But he's also looking out for the little guy.
Right.
He wants to equalize things.
Yeah, you got to equalize everyone.
When do you remember first seeing Denzel, Bryan? What was your introduction?
I'm trying to remember. I can't think of any movie I saw him in when I was younger necessarily. I think I definitely remember watching a lot of Spike Lee's movies when I was in like high school. And I, of course, just love him in like Malcolm X, and like He Got Game is such a great performance from him. But also Inside Man, I think really like, is a great showcase for what he can do as an actor. But he is one of those actors where I'll watch any vehicle movie he's in. Right, any Denzel vehicle I will watch. I even watched that fucking awful movie, The Little Things, the John Lee Hancock movie.
Oh,
which
right,
is
yeah, with Jared Leto, yeah.
awful. Right, and even that, he's kind of sleepwalking through it, but there is something just inherently compelling about him, and he's just one of those figures that is so authoritative in a movie. You believe anything he says. You believe him as any, he often plays like cops, and I think that's so great for him because he, like, you just believe him. You believe his, like, authority and that he can solve the murder or whatever. But I also just love him, even in stuff like Philadelphia, where he is playing a bit more of a dramatic role. And, he's also the type of actor that I think elevates anything he's in. He's done like a couple like Edward Zwick movies, like the Courage Under Fire and The Siege. Not very good movies by any means, but he really just kind of holds all of those by just being so magnetic. He, like, you just can't keep your eyes off of him. And I think for this movie, it's a very classic Denzel performance of around this time in Deja Vu, right? He's the cop and he knows how to do this, but there's something I really love about him when just him bouncing off of other people is my favorite thing in the world, right? Like, there's the scene where he's talking to Adam Goldberg in the movie, and Adam Goldberg's like, "You understand it yet?" And he goes like, "Yeah, no, not at all."
Yes.
And that moment, there's a million of those like moments in any of his movies, but it's the moment where you just go like, God, this fucking guy is just so great to watch. I love him, and I love how he's embraced kind of how he's getting a bit older, and he's embraced that a bit more. And I've just loved seeing his later performances, like in Equalizer, where he just gets to like fuck people up, or in like the Tragedy of Macbeth, where he is like just incredible. I mean, just delivering those like Shakespearean dialogue with like the most incredible amount of energy. I love him. I think he's incredible, and he's one of the just best movie stars of all time. I can't really like think of someone else at that level of him.
Well, and what also works is, like, Yonathan was kind of mentioning this, but it's fascinating how, like, Deja Vu kind of feels like it's at the end of sort of that daddy Denzel phase, right? Because you look at, like, some of the, like, you mentioned the Shakespeare thing, the kind of two different points of Denzel you can kind of track with the two big Shakespeare movies he did, because he's in the Kenneth Branagh Much Ado About Nothing, and he's so full of, like, young charisma and charm, and he's just, like, pulling off, especially the Shakespeare kind of comedy energy, with just, like, so much finesse, and so perfectly. And then you go to Tragedy of Macbeth, and modern Denzel, while he does have a lot of energy, he's really fully embraced the kind of like, man, I'm fucking tired. I'm just tired of all your fucking shit, and I can't handle it. I'm done. Especially as like Macbeth, just like, oh my god, my wife's nagging me, and I gotta rule over a kingdom. Everything's black and white. It's so fucking dull here. I hate it. But Man on Fire feels like you're starting to, like, he still has a lot of that energy from his youth, but still at the same time there's a lot of that sort of like world weariness starting to really creep in, which is really key to this character that he's playing here of Douglas Carlin, who, I guess, brief kind of plot thing if you're somehow unaware of what Deja Vu is. So Deja Vu starts off with this big ferry in New Orleans. It's getting off the dock, and it immediately explodes. There was a bomb on this ferry, and it's claimed the lives of about, I believe they say 543 people, and Denzel plays Douglas Carlin, who's this ATF agent who's investigating this horrible tragedy, and while he's investigating, he starts kind of putting some interesting clues together about who this domestic terrorist might be who's done this, and there's even a whole side thing of him investigating this murder that looks like it was a part of the ferry, but at the same time the body was found about an hour or so before the explosion of this young woman played by Paula Patton, and he starts investigating with this group of tech folks who are part of the FBI led by Val Kilmer, along with some of the more tech folks like Adam Goldberg, Eldon Hansen, Eric Alexander, who are in front of these big monitors where they are looking at these very detailed, what they initially say are digital recreations of what's been going on over the course of the last several days. Basically, they can look back to about 4 days prior to whatever specific time they're looking at and see just sort of like every single individual angle of like, okay, what's going on in this particular part of New Orleans here and everything else. And as it turns out, as things go along, Denzel realizes that they're kind of full of shit about it being quote-unquote digital projections, and firmly realizing that they are able to see into the past. That this is very much like a sort of gateway into time travel kind of thing. But they're only saying that they can like see things, they aren't able to like go back in time. But Denzel kind of wants to prove them wrong, especially as he becomes a bit more invested in Paula Patton's character, who they watch closely given all this weird circumstances around her death. As I kind of mentioned when we were doing our kind of bonus episode at the beginning of the season, this is one of the ones I had not seen before. This was a blind spot in my Tony Scott filmography. A lot, like most of, like I only have a couple more. I kind of want to savor them, given there's a limited supply of Tony Scott out there for me to see.
Yeah.
But this was one of the bigger ones I hadn't seen. I also haven't seen stuff like, Bryan was mentioning, like Revenge. I also haven't seen Unstoppable. So I'm kind of saving those. I'm doling those out necessarily. But yeah, I'm guessing you both had seen this prior. Especially Yonathan, I sent you the list of like pretty much all the movies that were available most of the season, and you immediately gravitated toward Deja Vu. Why did you want to cover this one in particular?
What actually happened with my first time watching Deja Vu was I only recall seeing some of the commercials where it just had Denzel talking to Paula Patton, like, have we met? And like just talking about Deja Vu. There was no mentioning of anything science fiction related. Like at most it was like, if you realize something that you've just seen, it seems so familiar. That engaged me enough. Unfortunately, I missed it in theaters. So I was just watching with a bunch of friends who are also studying in STEM fields. And what really caught me was the scene with the laser pointer. Because this was 2006. It's completely believable for a procedural to think of like, oh, the Patriot Act is in. They're like spying on everything. You can get angles all over the place. We were okay with it. We were just following along. But seeing and realizing that this was actually a window into the past, it became a science fiction movie that was different from all the other time travel movies that we have seen. And it's with Denzel Washington. Like that's what really resonated with me way back in, I believe I saw it in like 2007 or 2008. It just seemed like it was too soon from Katrina to actually believe it was in 2006, but that really stuck with me for so long, of like the actual story of Denzel being like connecting with a woman that he met on basically the autopsy table, and then actually seeing her life and wanting to save her. Like there's so few like law enforcement characters that are all about like saving people in fiction. It really is more like just get the bad guy. And that I feel like is important. I feel like that's something that shows a Denzel's character, like actually as an actor, as a person, like to actually be someone that wants to help rather than just kill some people. Like, I mean, yeah, Equalizer is fun, but I at least felt like that there was still emotional core, even if it was one-sided, since he was just looking through a mirror. But engagement on that. Also, the fact that there are very few movies involving terrorism that involves the ATF, because in most cases the ATF are just there to prove if the explosion is something that was caused by an accident or was man-made, and then it just goes off to the FBI or whatever. So having Denzel Washington covering a specific agency that actually also deals with a lot of domestic terrorism, because yeah, like they keep talking about Oklahoma City, the ATF building was attacked. Like there's like all this stuff about history that it just stuck with me. Like just also was coming back to it. So I know that there are a lot of more interesting hard sci-fi movies that are in this season, but to have a movie that does go into basically a time slice of a certain era in America, as well as following a black lead where it didn't feel like it was somehow weird or put upon, it was such a refreshing choice that I had to actually talk about it with you guys.
Well, yeah, it's also really interesting given this is the only sci-fi movie that Tony Scott ever made. Apparently, if you look back into the history of this movie being made, apparently there was a lot of back and forth about Tony Scott maybe wanting to get rid of more of like the sci-fi elements, wanting to kind of dress them down a bit from the original script. And I feel like that, there's a version of this where, maybe they completely remove like the time travel element of it necessarily. And it's more about, like you mentioned, getting the guy, which we'll have to address that bridge when we get to it about the villain of this movie. But it is so fascinating where like this time travel element of it, which also could go like so wrong in terms, like you mentioned, that one-sided nature of it. I think it's mainly just because of Denzel's ability to make that kind of, really emphasizing a lot of like that loss that he's had in his life and that regret without like overtly showing or having a scene where it's just like, my daughter and my wife were horribly murdered in some kind of like past trauma thing. So I have to like give it, as opposed to just like, he just seems like a guy who's really alone and doesn't have a lot of like people to tether to. He's married to his job in that way. Having that just be more of the catalyst for like, well, no, I have to like save this one person. That whole speech that he gives are just like, look, I spend most of my time trying to catch a guy after they did something horrible. I want to catch him before he does something horrible and save some people. I think makes it so much more embracing. I think also really emphasizes like Tony Scott doing this like kind of sci-fi element where like the sci-fi is like a crucial piece of this, but much of the action and the character stuff is a lot more grounded in an interesting way, which makes it, I think, a very unique amongst especially like hard sci-fi. Bryan, was the first time you watched this then like during your big Tony Scott catch-up last year?
It was, yeah. So I pretty much watched all his movies in order. So like right after Domino, I watched this one.
Weird back and forth, by the way.
Very
Those
weird.
two very different movies.
Yeah, he has such a weird career. But I remember the first time I had kind of seen this movie or heard of it, right? Because I didn't really know of it, really, weirdly enough. And then I read the premise for it, and I just thought, this sounds like a movie made for me, right? It is this, a movie about a guy trying to find a terrorist, but it has this sort of weird sci-fi twist to it. What really strikes me about this movie, and especially the opening of this movie, is that Tony Scott really cares about people. He's a real empathetic filmmaker, and I think he really, in a lot of his movies, has always shown that he loves people. And it is kind of weird for him to make, it's also just weird for him to make this movie and something like Man on Fire, which both feel very American. Like he's I feel like he and his brother Ridley, like, both changed a lot of the ways that films looked in the 2000s, right? Like Ridley, of course, with like Gladiator and like Black Hawk Down. I think both of those movies really influence a lot of the way that like movies looked around that time. And same with Tony Scott, right? With that freneticism. Like I think, Jonathan, you mentioned like he can often be kind of put in the same category as like Michael Bay, where he is like garish and big and self-indulgent or whatever. But he's really not, and he's a really human filmmaker. Like, what I love about the beginning of the movie is how much he lingers on these random people that you're watching, and as they get on this ferry, as they go through their day and just kind of take pictures and be happy, and he really lingers on those, so that when the explosion happens at the beginning, it really kind of hammers down the tragedy of this. And that paired with the movie going into this kind of traditional kind of cop procedural, right, where he's finding clues, he's questioning people, etc., etc. And then the way the movie takes this sci-fi turn where, if you don't know what it's about, you're just kind of not expecting it, weirdly enough. And it's a genuine turn for the movie that is so fascinating. Like, especially just him being driven to that building, and the way that I think Val Kilmer is like, you have questions, and he says like, for me to have questions, I have to know something, which is a great line of just kind of the mystery of this situation. It is a movie that is very much ingrained in like that hard sci-fi, explaining how time travel works, but also it is this cop procedural, while also being this movie that is very much about like post 9/11 America, and specifically, of course, post Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and just the sense of location that he has with this movie, right? Like, it is specifically New Orleans. Like, we see a lot of like the French Ward, we see a lot of like just landmarks and stuff like that. And so the way it's able to balance that stuff while also being this kind of weird Hitchcockian, it's Vertigo in so many ways, right? Like it is so much like Vertigo, and it's just this weird mishmash of things, and it should not work at all, especially directed by someone like Tony Scott, who is like kind of big and stylish and whatnot, but it really does work for me. And I just, all the elements of this movie that just come together and create this like weird assortment of things, but it all feels so human, like I think he never forgets. Like I love the scene when Denzel's talking to Paula Patton's like father, and he gives her all the pictures, and he says like, she needs to matter to you, like you need, like she needs to, you need to care about her so that you can solve her murder. It's just a thing about Tony Scott that like as much as he is incredibly stylish and so like, rapid and zippy and stuff like that, is he just doesn't forget about those human elements, which are very important to this movie, because it doesn't work if you don't have that.
Yeah, which is especially interesting in contrast to Ridley, who was much more cold as a filmmaker, to the degree that like if you showed me like Thelma and Louise without telling me which Scott director directed it, I would have immediately assumed Tony, because the movie has far more warmth and empathy than I would expect Ridley to ever have, as opposed to Tony,
right?
Kind of thing. And I think that is fascinating, especially with this particular movie, where it is so much like you mentioned, like the kind of that time and place element of it. Like this is literally a movie that could only come from specifically like 2006, because of the weird timing where like you mentioned, like they were set to shoot there around the time of like Hurricane Katrina happening, and then it happened, and they were like, oh, should we move location? What do we do? But they were very adamant about like, no, we got to go back here, and we have to like really like bring work over to New Orleans, but also I think really immerse the movie in this particular like devastation that's already happened. Like there's that point where Bruce Greenwood kind of talks about just like the city's faced so much over as of recent, but this very thing is already adding on top of that. It's weird realizing like it's made in between like Hurricane Katrina, and then another detail about this movie that I just noticed, especially given like 2006, so much smoking indoors. And I was like, well, this is like the last time you could make a movie about like smoking indoors, right? And I looked it up. Louisiana officially passed like the you can't smoke indoors thing unless you're in a bar legally on January 1st, 2007. So literally, this is like the last time you could make this movie. Like the bit where he's talking with the coroner guy at the morgue, he just has a cigarette in his fucking mouth.
Oh yeah,
that felt like that was something out of like a 1970s like thriller. It was so out of place. Like even just having the coroner, like he's just like, yeah, whatever. It's like like it is shocking because it didn't click that it was like that year. The whole thing about the smoking indoors, it felt more like to me as like a movie trope rather than realizing like, oh, this is history. Oh my god.
It's really fucking wild. But I mean, yeah, let's talk about some of these other cast members. Like Bryan, we were kind of talking off mic before Yonathan got on. You were kind of surprised going back to it that Val Kilmer was in here. You kind of forgot it.
I forgot he was in this movie.
Which is really fascinating, especially when you like watch this movie. And Val Kilmer prior to this usually either played like extremely cool people, like fucking like Bruce Wayne Batman, or very bizarre like kind of over the top characters. Like this is like right after Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, where he's playing a much more like on a certain like higher over the topness of a character, versus like this movie, it's maybe his most subdued performance. I mean, not. I guess technically that would be like the Snowman, only because he's like sedated.
Oh god, no, let's not.
And overdubbed. No,
let's not bring that up.
But this feels like he's much more like buttoned up and much more professional of like an FBI agent, which is like so weird to me. But he fits it perfectly. He kind of like almost blends into the background of it in a good way, in a way that, like you mentioned, it kind of feels like it feels almost like you don't even recognize it's Val Kilmer.
Yeah, I have to agree with what you were saying. Like, it just blends into the background because even I forgot he was in this movie. It's just like that. But I feel like that there are characters that could be in that role that would be more antagonistic. Being a layman or being someone who's more of an anti-intellectual who would be like forcing like, who cares about all this sci-fi mumbo jumbo? We're just here to get the bomber and all that kind of thing. But he quickly just is emotionally attached to the story. Like he gets Denzel's position, ATF, just trying to solve this mystery, and he wants to work with him because he also understands that he's part of the operation and understands that there's a strict time window. And instead of trying to deal with like, oh, I'm the big FBI guy, I'm coming down from from headquarters and all that, while you have someone who's more local, who knows the area, who knows people, like it makes more sense for him to be more in the background to actually allow, like, I guess even the more out there cast, like I would have to say all the scientists, and even if they have like one or two lines, they at least seem like kooky science type of characters. Well, you have the FBI agent who's not no nonsense, but he is serious, but it doesn't feel like something that's like clashing with anything that's happening with the story.
I love that one bit after Denzel is like told basically like, oh, we found that car over there that's your partner's. We found it on the ferry. Really emphasizing that his partner is dead. And then he leaves, and then there's just the bit where Bruce Greenwood talks to Val Kilmer and says, what do you think about him? You know, I like him. Yeah, I like him too. Like, I like that so much. They've been just like, yeah, he's a cool dude. And he's a pretty cool dude.
It's a good point you made, Jonathan, about like Val Kilmer not being the type of character you would expect in like one of these types of movies, where he would come, you would expect him to come in and it would be like, I don't know, fucking Ed Harris or something, and he'd be like, this is my jurisdiction, you know, stay out of our way kind of thing. And he's not like that at all, and he's very reserved. And I think also having someone like Val Kilmer, he's a cool guy still, you know, and having him contrast with like all the scientists who, I like it because they all look like nerds, like genuine nerds, you know? They don't look like, you know, Adam Goldberg, I guess you could, you know, he's pretty handsome, I guess, but like they all just look so nerdy. And you have Val Kilmer there who is kind of like driving all of them, and he's just a cool guy. Yeah, he is such a welcome presence in this movie as well, because from the first time you see him and he's like looking for like Denzel under the bridge, and Denzel's like, oh, there's like, this is under here, and it would only be under here if the bomber was under here. And just from that very moment, you don't get him, again, like, trying to step on Denzel's toes or anything. You get him being like, oh, that's a good, like, yeah, and then he helps him, like, get up on top of the ledge and everything. I love how kind of collaborative it is between them. And, you know, like, again, lesser movies would do something like that, or lesser movies would have, like, later when he goes to the past, it would have like a scene where Val Kilmer is like, no, you don't understand. Like, no one's ever done this before. You can't do this, whatever. And like, he just understands. He's like, just turn the lights off when you're done. It's so shit. Yeah.
What also really works, like you mentioned, the three kind of scientist characters that we follow. What I really like is that they're all three of them are like nerdy, but in very specific different ways, where like Adam Goldberg is much more like brash, kind of abrasive, with like, he does kind of bring up the thing you're talking about, just like, look, no one's ever done this before, even when you do your spirituality, God's already made his mind up about this or whatever, but in a very like charming, funny way. It was especially like his brief asides, like, oh, look at that, isn't that sweet? I wish I had someone. But and then there's Eldon Hansen, who I think does a great job playing a guy who doesn't talk that much, and then when he does pipe in, it's very quiet, like the bit where they're talking about like, oh, remember that big outage that happened? The whole northeastern United States went dark. We blamed Canada for it. And then Eldon's just like, my bad. And then they just keep moving from it. But Erica Alexander, I think, is so great at playing kind of like someone who just can't like express her emotions that well. Like, she feels kind of like bottled up. Like, there's that whole bit where she's explaining about like the different time dilations or whatever, like the different like breaches in timelines. And there's a point where she kind of just like is saying a sentence at one point. She's talking about like, if we quantify like this or whatever, then she pauses, and then we've been working so hard on this and we don't know exactly what's going on. Like, she get like mid-sentence like breaks it apart. There's like that, or her emotional reactions to especially the death of Matt Craven playing the partner, I think are like so vital for that.
Yes,
like
yes.
It feels so visceral when she reacts to that stuff. They feel like three very different but realistic nerds you would have met.
What I love about like Erica Alexander's character is like the scene where when they're like watching her in the shower, and she's the one who kind of says something and is like, do we really need to watch this woman like shower right now? And it is this like moment of like, I don't know, you get so much, again, like empathy from her character, but also you just kind of understand her character a bit more, right? Like you realize like, oh, this is like, she is the only woman in here, and like you can tell that like this is something that makes her a bit uncomfortable. And I don't know, it's a scene that I think just really, I think, hammers down a lot of those like human emotions that Tony Scott is really good at.
I have to agree, especially because you made the point I was going to make about the point that she is the only woman in the room and she has a PhD. She has been in these situations. Most likely, they've been going through these types of scenarios that she's dealt with men that would be a little too creepy, and the fact that her calling it out, like I feel like calling it Eldon Henson, like the thing is like everyone was staring at him, and I feel like you do meet these type of people in STEM fields. Like you have the guy. I would say you probably see like Eldon Henson at Comic-Con over the weekend, and then he just goes back to working on the Hadron Collider. While I feel like with Erica Alexander, she feels more like someone that would be more reserved. Like she maybe has like a cat or something. Like she has this such a quiet life kind of style, but she still wants to exist while not trying to be cramped upon. Which honestly, I feel like that there could have been a movie that easily could erase just her character, and it would just be worse off because, as you said, she is probably the emotional core of the three. Even if I think Adam Goldberg really does quaff his hair so perfectly that it feels like he should be something like that, he could actually be like someone that actually, has some emotional connection, but she's the real lifeline. Like once she's out, I actually do miss her far more than any of the other side characters once we jump into the actual time travel. Also, I really forgot, like, because that whole scene with the shower, like I think that was probably my first clue. Oh, this is where Denzel's like, wait, why would someone be weirded out by a digital recreation? Because it feels more like trying to protect someone's privacy, a real person's privacy. Those are the little nuggets here and there that I do like how they try to build up to the point with the laser. But I do feel like that it's great that it comes from coming from a black woman not wanting to see another black woman showering, which also I'm kind of shocked that we saw so much in a PG-13 movie. But again, that might just be because it's a 2006 film. There was a little more weird leeway, but it actually was good as a plot point, if anything.
Yeah. We should also, I guess, talk about Paula Patton as well. Paula Patton, one of the great, I think, mistakes of Hollywood is that they forgot about Paula Patton. She's like so great, like in charming in like her limited role here. And I mean, it's weird. We talked earlier this season about Crimes of the Future, and I brought up the Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, like fight scene she has with Lea Seydoux. She's so stellar in Ghost Protocol, and the way that series kind of dumps her, and then Hollywood kind of dumps her after that too. It's such a shame. I think she's very charming, very charismatic. Also can hold her own in terms of like some of the action Beach Even has to do in this movie. The bit where she has to like jump from like the dock to the ferry as it's leaving.
Oh yeah,
such a great fucking shot. Such a great stunt as well. Yeah, it's a real shame that Hollywood just kind of like left her off to the side.
I think it's just like because Unstoppable has Rosario Dawson. It feels like the roles that you would expect Paula Patton just go straight to Rosario Dawson for the next decade. And then again, they just kind of forget about these great women of color that can do these types of roles. And then they just come back in some one-off way. Like it took me forever to realize that Erica Alexander was in American Fiction last year. Or like it just happens like that. And it is unfortunate that Paula Patton is pretty much forgotten. I would honestly think that she could have gone on and been another muse for Tony Scott. Who knows? Maybe post Unstoppable, there could have been something that we could have seen with her.
It would be really cool considering she is in Ghost Protocol if they brought her back in like I know they're filming like 8, like it's basically done already, but like it would be cool with the way that franchise kind of just like brings back characters every once in a while if they brought her back, because yeah, she is so great in Ghost Protocol, and it would be great to kind of get her in another big movie. She's great in this movie, I think, while we see her like through the window, through the Snow White machine as they call it, And she's great in those scenes, but I think what I really love about her performance is when the movie, what I love so much about this movie is how it basically does this magic act in the last 30 minutes where she basically takes charge of the movie and really kind of has a lot of agency, and really, like, she does that really cool jump from, like, the dock to the ship. That stuff is, I think, really where she shines in this movie, especially off of Denzel, when she's trying to figure out, like, is this guy actually a cop, or is he, like, you know, kind of shady or whatever. Like, those scenes are really great, and especially, like, I mean, the ending of this movie, I think she just fucking sells that ending. I think she's really incredible in this movie, and even though her and Denzel don't have that many scenes together, I think it's a testament to both actors that they have, like, pretty great chemistry from just those few scenes we get of them together.
She's very central to, like, a lot of the sort of setup and payoff the movie has, where so much of, like, you know, the things that we get, you know, like the ultimate reveals of later are built around, like, seeing her apartment, seeing her do all those things, or even Denzel investigating early on and, like, hearing the answering machine. And, like, it really has to be sold on, one, like, Tony Scott's amazing, like, visuals for a lot of these scenes, like, keep that stuff in your brain. But then her also, like her delivery on, like, the one answering machine bit where, like, her friend calls and says, "Oh, you didn't call me last night, so I wanted to be sure." And she's like, "Is this a joke? Like, I have somebody here. I'll call you back later." Like, all of that, it becomes so crucial when that, like, comes up later, which I'll just say, like I say, I hadn't seen this movie before. But during that last, like, I don't know, 40 or so minutes where, like, Denzel has gone back in time and we get all those payoffs, I'm, like, pumping my fist. Like, yeah, they fucking are doing it.
You can save her.
You can save her.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an incredible magic act, and, like, and not only just the way that it pays off, like, it kind of closes the loop on a lot of those things early on where you're like, what's going on here? But again, the way that it transitions from Denzel in the past trying to, like, solve this murder to she basically controls the movie, and by the end of it, she knows what has happened, kind of, over Denzel, who doesn't really know. It's such an incredible, like, little magic act, and it's one of my favorite things that, like, movies can do like that, which is just kind of flip the script and just give this character who we have seen throughout the movie, but just give them so much of that agency and of that drive in the movie. It's so great.
Paula Patton, with the agency that she has in the story, you're right, it does make her into another protagonist. I feel like that there is a lesser story where it's still Denzel doing all these big things, and she's just there just to disrupt the space-time continuum, but not actually contributing. I feel like the moment when they're in the car, surrounded by all the agents, and Denzel just says, "If we get out, everyone dies," and she just has this look like, all right, I gotta do this.
Yeah.
And then they floor it. Like, that is just perfect. It's so rare to see this in movies where the love interest is actually so active in the climax of a movie. That's why I still feel so bad that Paula Patton hasn't done much since Mission Impossible, especially in action movies.
The way the movie was going, I was very worried at that point where it's like, oh no, she's been captured, now she's in the car,
Right.
She's like a damsel in distress. And then I love that she not only kills our bad guy, but also is, like, very upset even with the agency she has to be, like, because she feels so much more like a normal person caught up in, like, this insane fucking thing where it's like this guy shows up, it's just like, hey, guess what, I know all of this shit about you, I know things before they're gonna happen, and also there's gonna be a fairy explosion, and also that guy who kidnapped you is the one responsible for it, and how that all, like, really weighs on her when she kills Jim Caviezel, and then it's just like, oh my god, I killed him, and Denzel's just like, nah, I did all the work.
Yeah.
He finished him off.
And the way that, like, when they're at her apartment, for instance, and she kind of turns on him and she's like, "You're not a cop. Like, what the fuck is going on here?" I love the way that scene's handled, because you can imagine, like, a lesser movie getting bogged down by that for, like, 20 minutes, where, like, maybe she shoots him or something, and then Denzel's like, "No, you don't believe me," like, blah 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 blah. And the way that the movie, it uses that line of, like, that Denzel uses, and that she says to him at the end of like, if you had to tell someone the most important thing in the world, but they didn't believe you, like, how would you do that? And it's just such a great way of handling what can be a very bad like third act thing of like the two characters turn on each other or whatever. And yeah, and the way it just kind of like those last like 30 minutes really just fly by, right? Like you go from Caviezel's like lair to her apartment to the ferry in this like very fluid sort of final act. I don't know, it just flows so well, even though it feels like it's gonna fall apart any minute, even though it never does, which is so great.
Let's address the cue in the room, I guess, with Caviezel here. I knew he was in this movie. I was aware of that, and I'm like, all right, whatever. It is so weird, because I don't think that guy's necessarily a terrible actor, in terms of stuff. Like, this is even, like, not too long after he was whipped on screen for 2 hours by Mel Gibson while he was playing Jesus. And I think he can sell some of those, like, elements, but I was kind of astonished how, like, this ends up being kind of, like, the perfect role for Jim Caviezel in terms of like who he is.
Yes.
It's crazy. Because he's playing like this, I'm not saying he's a domestic terrorist or anything like that, but he definitely has a lot of stuff about like, when that whole thing we talking to Denzel talking about like, well, I was directed by the Army and the Navy and all that because I'm a patriot and I don't like the idea of being around patriots. And he has like the fucking camouflage jacket that has like the American flag like stitched into it, and all of his talk about what true patriotism is and all this other shit. I'm just like, oh fuck, this guy would be Q if this movie was made like fucking 15 years later. This is wild.
I mean, this is what I love so much about this movie is it is so much, it's steeped so much in post 9/11 America and post 9/11 like again that sort of beginning where all the people are crowded together. It feels very post 9/11 of like all these people crowded together. So like, it reminds me of like the beginning of the monologue of like War of the Worlds, right? Where Morgan Freeman is like, and when we least expected it, they were like coming for us. And I'm like, gee, okay, we get it. Like 9/11 happened. Like, but the way that this movie uses that idea of post 9/11 like terrorism and just kind of fear, but also again the American people quote unquote like coming together and all that stuff, and turns it into this movie about domestic terrorism, which feels so again prescient for like now and feels very it's not what you would expect this kind of movie to be around this time.
Well, especially when you would expect it to be like a Middle Eastern terrorist of some sort, and be like very firmly of its time in that way, and it avoids that very wisely.
Yeah, I would say because, as I mentioned, like the ATF has been involved with so much domestic terrorism. The fact that you have Jim Caviezel basically looking like Timothy McVeigh, like everyone constantly talking about Oklahoma City, like it feels like the perfect type of antagonist for Denzel Washington without needing to go into the Christian fundamentalism that you do see in these types of domestic terrorists, or even try to bring up any sort of racial thing. But you kind of have Denzel Washington and Paula Patton being the two main people interacting with this guy. And it just, you can't ignore it. And I absolutely agree. Like there's a point like him just, this is the perfect role for Jim Caviezel today. I mean, he says the words "cost of freedom." In my head, I watch it like, I don't like the sound of that. I mean, like, oh no, oh god, no. And I feel like that it is kind of fair that there is a point that if you're rejected by the military, there is something fundamentally wrong, and it's kind of surprising. It is actually fitting that it went more for the explosives route, because there's clearly a story that would have been made 10 years after this that would have had to be more of a shooter type of situation, like some sort of killing spree. Like it, I feel like it was very poignant to focus it on like a ferry explosion and actually connecting it to Katrina, like we kind of skipped over that there was initial plans when the script was written that it could have been Long Island to connect even more to 9/11, also with and all that. Like, you definitely could have seen that version. It may not have been I don't want to say skinhead. He still had hair, but to have a domestic terrorist, it probably would have been a foreign terrorist to like try to do 9/11 part 2 or something. But in the head of Jim Caviezel, like, he's trying to prevent that type of scenario, even though he's already just killing innocent lives. Even if, however you feel about the Navy, these were just guys off on shore leave, like celebrating. Like, it's just someone who's claiming to fight for justice and taking down tyrants when it's just innocent blood. I'm afraid that there could have been ways that they could have made him seem more interesting, like John Doe in Seven, but they just went straight for he's just crazy. He's a crazy guy that is based off of actual real terrorists that people were ignoring in 2006. Even now in 2024, that is a problem that needs to be addressed. A decent enough performance, and we should be watching out Jim Caviezel's next few roles and his afternoon activities.
And what sounds he might make.
Yes.
Whatever sounds of freedom may come from him. At the end there, where they do kind of add the shooter elements in terms of like he's, you know, like shooting people up on the ferry when he's like actually there in like the alternate timeline. I was just waiting for like, is he going to open up his jacket and there's going to be like a Punisher logo with like the American flag colors draped over it? Like, that's all that's missing from his fucking outfit to fit to now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And like, he's pretty good in this movie, right? Like, yeah, I kind of hate Jim Caviezel as a person, but like, he is a good actor, you know? Like, I like him in like The Thin Red Line, and he fits this movie, again, like you mentioned, almost too perfectly based on what we know now. Yeah, and just the scene, that scene with Denzel where he does the interrogation, when he sniffs his like water and just kind of all that stuff is such a great back and forth between him and Denzel.
And even his little bit where he talks about like this case won't even go to trial. It's like, well, technically he's right because he doesn't have a trial by the end of that. But yeah, especially the bit where he plays like so perfectly hateable to contrast with the most likable movie star guy ever in that interrogation scene. Oh, yeah. Like the bit where he just keeps talking about like, all the stuff that I'm doing this. Is like, well, what happened next? I think you know what happened next. No, I don't know. Why don't you tell me? I'll tell you what you did. Just like, yeah, fuck him up, Denzel, with your words. Do it. Only other cast person I just want to mention, you kind of referenced like the Navy stuff early on, Yonathan, with like the guys coming off shore leave. I was stunned while watching, especially that opening bit, and we get like, you know, great like ensemble of extras and how like perfectly like Tony Scott shoots all these bits so you can remember it later on when he repeats them basically for the Deja Vu and all. But when I saw a little blonde girl,
oh my God,
wait a minute, hold on. I know what a fanning looks like when shot with 2000s era Tony Scott filming techniques. It's Elle. It's little baby Elle. I'm like, oh my gosh, she doesn't even have like all her front teeth. This is crazy.
Yeah. And it's so nice, especially considering that he had worked with Dakota, of course, on Man on Fire, which, like, if you ever want to hear, like, I think get a good sense of what Tony Scott was like, watch interviews with Dakota Fanning around the time Man on Fire came out, because she has such great stories of, like, meeting Tony Scott and just how he showed up to, like, with his, like, pink hat and, like, short shorts and everything. Like, it makes him seem like just such an absolute sweetheart, and I love that he was able to work with both of the Fannings.
Real Fanning fan.
A Fanning, if you will.
Yeah, his movie, the Fanning. I'm so sorry.
But you know what? Let's while we're talking about Tony Scott, let's talk about some of these sequences, like particularly that fucking car chase. Like, this movie was already like so great for me in terms of all these like sci-fi things we're talking about, and then fucking Tony Scott gets to put in a car chase in such an amazing, unique way too, where Denzel has to get into this car, put on this helmet that's able to like get him the perspective of like, oh, we have to catch who this guy is, the Jim Caviezel character. In order to find him, he has to drive while this like fucking thing is on his head, and everyone can like see from his perspective, but he puts down the goggles attempting to like kind of see what exactly would be going on from like 4 days ago to try and chase this guy while there is a live traffic going on. Like, such a thrilling way of doing a car chase, which Tony Scott did plenty of great car chases in his time.
Yeah.
But this is one of his best just because it's like it adds just a whole nother layer of like, you're trying to chase a guy from 4 days ago while there's traffic going on in this actual timeline. It's so well done, and it has like all that viscerality of a Tony Scott like chase sequence, while at the same time having that added edge of like, but you got to get like in front of the car so you can see his fucking face and ID him.
Oh my god! The moment Denzel goes into the other lane and he's dodging cars while trying to angle the headset to follow Caviezel's car, like it is so scary that I'm feeling like I would crash like 2 seconds into it. But this is Denzel Washington. He's a superhero. He has cat-like reflexes. He can follow it all along, like as well as getting perfect directions from everyone back in the lab. Like it is thrilling and insane that on top of the explosion in the beginning, like just having the car pile up just going on, and like Denzel's car is like down for like a minute, and you think like, is he out? But he gets up like in a minute and still keeps going. Like, I forgot how thrilling Tony Scott can do car chases.
It is just that like that frenetic kind of cut like editing that he does, right? And like again, it's part of the thing that like a lot of people take the wrong kind of influence from that, right? And kind of just you get the kind of like quick cutty kind of action movie, you know? But he just knows how to shoot this in a way where it is just frenetic enough to where you were just like on the edge of your seat, but he really gives you the information in a readable way. This car chase scene is a great example of just kind of the thing we were talking about earlier of just like the grayness and the blandness of a lot of modern action movies, where like that action sequence looks incredible and there is a genuine sense of like where it is in New Orleans, and like I don't know enough about the geography to know if it's correct or not, but again, there's an effort where he's like, oh, he's on the I-10. Is he going east or west? Is he going here or here? And like, just all of that stuff and the way that it looks. And I love the look of the headset that he has to wear. It's like just the sci-fi elements of this movie are weirdly lo-fi in a lot of ways, right? Like, I love the way the headset looks like this kind of like, you could break it really easily if you messed with it too long.
It's put together with like glue and duct tape, basically.
Right. Yeah. And like the way that when he wants to like get out of the car and use it, he has to put on like a backpack that acts as like a battery pack.
Like a fucking scuba suit,
Oh,
basically.
no.
Right.
No, it's like the best type of idea of doing a prototype. Everyone thinks of like technology when it's like the first version is all sleek and cool. Like it really looks like something that was like built as like, here's an idea of what we can do as a next step for this window, but not all of us like to go out. So it's kind of clunky and hard to wear and all that. Like it fits more for a big stocky white guy rather than Denzel Washington.
Even like going to like the look of like the actual window, that room itself, it looks like an editing bay, right? Like, and the thing that they use to like to rewind is like, it looks exactly like just editing tools, and it has this kind of analog feel, even though this movie is taking place at like, you know, in 2006, right, when like the digital age is about to like start really, and like cell phones are about to become like so prominent.
Excuse me, we have plenty of 2006 era flip phones in here.
I'm sorry, yeah, flip phones, but you know, smartphones and stuff like that, and yeah, which also I guess gets into the element of this movie that I find so fascinating in that the way that it's about surveillance, you know, and also feels like a very post 9/11 thing. Like Yonathan, I know you mentioned like the Patriot Act earlier, and that all of the stuff when they're in that room and looking at like New Orleans and kind of, you know, looking at the phone booths and everything, it feels very, very, I used this word earlier, but prescient, right? Like it feels weirdly, you know, like the world we're living in today, of like just constant surveillance and just constantly being watched. And yeah, I don't know. I just find that element of the movie so fascinating, even though it also has these like insane car chases that end in like with like a huge explosion. You know, it's so fascinating. It's a fascinating mixture, I think.
Well, and also that whole car chase, you mentioned the whole like the editing thing with like, the editing bay kind of controls. I love how Tony Scott literally made a car chase about how you like the precision and the crucial element of timing with getting the shot. It's a whole car chase about cinematography, basically.
Yeah,
That's great. I love that. Like the only way they could be more Tony Scott is if like the stuff with Jim Caviezel took place at Magic Hour. It's like, you have to get the right angle of the sunset.
Right. We are missing those kind of burnt orange, like Tony Scott skies a little bit in this movie, but I guess the explosions kind of make up for that. But
True.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the scenes where they're kind of watching her life, like as she goes through her life, like the past few days of her life, because it's the stuff that feels the most Hitchcockian to me, especially I love the look of there's the scene where they go into the club in New Orleans, like through the window, and you see the people and they're like streaks of light, you know, that are like going through the buildings and everything. And I love the look of like the window that they use. It's perfectly like within the like that analog style that of course like it's very pre like iPhone and stuff like that, but it still feels like it's right on the edge of like the digital world. You know, does that make any sense? I don't know if...
Especially with, like, what I really like about a lot of that stuff, like, there's early on where there's the point where she talks about, like, oh, you're gonna see that guy, and it's like, on Monday, yeah, I can do Monday. Oh, no, are you sure about Monday? Like, hold on, I need to even look if I can do Monday. And they try and get the angle at the exact right point, like, let's see your schedule, and they miss it.
Yeah.
And it's like, what, we can't rewind? I love how that's the limitations that are set up with this technology. I think really also make, like, the hard sci-fi element of it really work. Where it's like, oh no, we can't rewind, we can't have a second chance. We have to get the specific angle at like 4 days to the exact like millisecond in order for it to work. We can't go back. And I just love that, like that element of it. Or even when they talk about like, we have a specific, like the window has a parameter, and there's stuff like, oh, wherever Jim Caviezel is talking to her on the phone, it's like, oh, it's in a payphone that's just outside, so we have to look into like a Bank of America like ATM camera for them to like look over to the other side of it, and they can't get like an actual ID, where it just shows up like even the surveillance that we're talking about, like the traditional surveillance of the kind of Patriot Act stuff that Yonathan's talking about, even has its limitations because of that analog element you're talking about. And they initially presented it as a digital thing. That's like, oh, even that also has limitations because we're dealing with the fabric of the universe potentially crumbling. And even stuff like when Denzel uses the laser pointer and it completely shuts down all of the power in, like, New Orleans when he does that. Just, like, all that kind of stuff where it shows, like, this isn't magic. There are rules that we have here that are, like, once again, they don't distract from the story. It only enhances the story because it's, like, we have limitations. So we have to get, like, the specific angle to, like, identify Jim Caviezel and all this other stuff. It adds to the tension.
Yeah, I have to say, like, even though it isn't digital, just seeing how they are reconstructing reality, it does feel like something that you are like downloading and reconstructing. So it has that feel of a limitation of just latency. Like even if like I mentioned with the scope, where you only have that certain range unless you have the headset. It feels like it still feels like a digital machine. Like it's not something that is a perfect view of everything, like almost like as if once we actually have it in our current time of like just having a smartphone trying to get correct the little things here and there so that you can get that perfect angle and picture. Like it's pressing in that sense just on the fact on technology, even if it's far more just going off of the ideas of the weird mechanics of like I said, it's a hole in the space-time continuum. There's no other way to explain it. It is a hole, even if it's a wormhole. But those aspects feel as if that there was like some sort of ideas of what was coming very soon, because this would be 4 years before the iPhone, I would say, maybe a little more. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, 2010, 2011, it's around
Yeah.
there, yeah.
Yeah.
Denzel has that line where he's like trying to find out how the thing works, and he says like, I don't know how a cell phone works, but I know how to use a cell phone. So tell me how to use this thing, which is, again, also feels very great. And also, like, the fact that, like, you know, what you said, Jonathan, made me think, like, they mention a few times in the movie that, like, it's a data stream. So like they're streaming, which is again another part of this movie that feels really, really modern in a way that is just like so inadvertently like forward thinking in a way where it's like they're streaming the past. It's so weird. It's so crazy.
And it also kind of like, it has almost the mechanics of like a video game almost, where it's like, oh, we can like live create like whatever's going on here, like generate this stuff in like real time, but there are still like the limitations. Like I'm just waiting for Paula Patton to like get up to like the edge of like the perimeter, and she just like keeps walking into like the invisible wall. Kind of thing. It almost feels like it's like there's that amount of like a limitation to it. Just like we're barely able to like keep this going as she like moves around.
Oh, like when they were tracking Caviezel in the car, like he just goes off of the range. Like it's almost like, oh, I just lost cell signal. The GPS can't find him.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yes.
the little things here and there that, yeah, you could definitely apply to it. Like I honestly think that there is a version of this story that you could do in the 2020s, but there could be things that just don't feel as novel because because we've seen it. We've seen, like I said, people are streaming. People can clip part of a live stream, edit some stuff, and post it on YouTube. Like there's just so much of what we're seeing with the whole editing that, yeah, I feel like it even talking about it, this feels far more prescient than viewing this a few days ago. This is why I feel like this can be considered a masterpiece, even if there are a lot of explosions that can distract some other audience members.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big shout out also to the screenwriters here who kind of wrote this on spec. Bryan, Marsili, and Terry Rossio, who we've
Our
talked
boy.
about previously. I'm going to say he's not our boy.
Not our
I'm
boy,
gonna
just to be clear, for legal reasons.
I'm going to draw a super line in the sand of like Terry Rossio is not our boy to any degree. But I mean, he is a very talented screenwriter when he's able to be.
Yeah.
And I think this is admittedly a really great example of where just the way this movie is constructed, it's like a great sort of time loop movie. Where like this one kind of fits more into the sort of like time loop as opposed to time travel element of it. Where it's like we have a specific range of like time that we're dealing with. And we have kind of like our setups and payoffs that make it kind of like, you know, to quote a certain person who who's made a lot of like sci-fi movies in his own degree, it's like poetry. It rhymes. Truly, it feels like just like you get like one side of it, and then when, like I said, when all that stuff keeps like being paid off, and it's like a fucking slot machine. I'm just like, yes, keep fucking going with it. I am such a sucker in particular for time travel stuff where this kind of thing happens, where we kind of have an earlier bit, like all the stuff where they're talking about like, oh, all your fingerprints are everywhere, and there's all these like little like bloody tissues and stuff that are going on, and that scene where it sneaks up on Denzel as like, admittedly, he's being patched up by Paula Patton, who's like touching him all over, and it's like, you know, I can see being distracted, but then he looks around at the environment, just realizes like, wait, my fingerprints, tissue, oh my god,
Yeah, and he doesn't.
he experiences that deja vu.
Yep.
And it's not harped on. Like it isn't like he doesn't linger on that as like a, whoa, can you believe this? It is just like, as an audience member, he trusts you to like the entire time. You're like, wait, but oh my, you know, it's the movie understanding like the audience is gonna get it by this point, and yeah, it's so genius. I mean, another movie that this reminds me of a lot actually is Tenet, with of course Denzel's son, and it feels very much like Christopher Nolan saw that movie and was like, it feels like this, but James Bondified. If
No, that
that's a
would make
term.
sense. No, I it's what I described, Tenet. It is definitely a James Bond movie that will never be made.
Yeah. But it has a lot of these elements of like, you know, I think the thing that I really like about time travel movies when they're done right, that time travel is this kind of conversation of the past speaking with the future, and this movie has it, of course, with the entire Paula Patton character. That's what, you know, that's what that is.
Right.
And of course, Tenet has that with like, you know, the whole backwards forwards thing. It's weird to think that like Christopher Nolan, someone who is very cold and very kind of distant, would be influenced by someone like Tony Scott, who is like complete opposite than him. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities, including like getting Denzel's son, of course, to be in that role is very, very interesting.
I don't know. I believe a guy who really loves the Fast and Furious movies also loves Tony Scott movies.
He does.
At least he's honest. There are a lot of people who would never admit to like Fast and Furious movies and make what are a bunch of high sci-fi films and other high concept action.
It's all about family, you know?
Roderick rules. That's always remember him saying Roderick rules.
My God. Well, we've been talking about Deja Vu for quite a while. Is there anything we haven't brought up yet you guys want to shout out before we get to like final thoughts and stuff?
I do like the walk up to Jim Caviezel's lair, so to speak. I've seen all the damage that was done by what Denzel does later in the movie, and then having the scientists be like, "Oh, we don't see any of this stuff." It's like, and it looks like a complete war zone. Like something big is going to happen, and it feels weird that no one talks about it after that, because it feels like if this guy was doing something so big, like blowing up a ferry and then possibly doing maybe more, like it would feel like at least someone would have mentioned. But the script just trusts itself to just lead you along.
I love that one bit where during that, where like there's the investigation going on after they find Matt Craven's body in this like alternate timeline that's been created. Denzel's just like talking with Val Kilmer and them, just like, look, we changed one thing, but we didn't change anything. And that one guy just interrupts him, just like, hey, do you need a mask? It's like, no, thank you. I appreciate it, but no thank you. Scott knows also how to pick like these smaller people for like the roles of like just functionaries around. Like there's that one bit early on where they're kind of talking about like do you see anybody in there? Like describe what's going on when they're investigating Paula Patton's apartment for the first time. And the guy's just looking around like, oh yeah, I see like a vanity table, mirror, Alexander's ass. And the guy's just like, he looks at his ass trick and then like pans up and the guy just gives a thumbs up. The one guy who says like, oh hey, this lady calls you. It's just like, maybe describe you. Like that guy, especially when Paula Patton calls him. And it's just like, can you describe it for him? Just like, yeah, 6'3", not too bad looking. No.
I love also that guy is like eating a cheeseburger in like 3 different times that Denzel calls him. It's really funny for some reason.
And also the bit where he gives him the phone number and it's just like, on a candy wrapper, it's all I had. I'll cut him down, right?
Oh, but then when that guy grabs the candy wrapper when he's on the phone, you're just like, like freaking out, like, oh my God, it's so crazy.
Yep.
Yeah. I will say also the scene where they find Caviezel's like his lair and the explosion and all that stuff, that also like, reminds me a lot of Tenet, right? Where he's like, what happened here? And John David Washington's like, it hasn't happened yet. And it's like, man, like, yeah, this is it's very interesting. But yeah.
I want to bring up Denzel's body language in this movie is incredible. Like the introduction, one of the great underrated Denzel introductions in the movie, which there are plenty of great ones, but him coming up with like his hands over his nose and his mouth, like he's just kind of like he's both in shock, but he wants to like play it off, or it's just like, oh my God, this is horrible, but I'm opening my hands and I'm surveying all this place. Like that whole scene does such a great job of introducing him, even down to him trying to call his partner, hearing the cell phone coming from one of the body bags, and you can tell for a second, it's like, is it him? No, it's a coincidence. That's not what happened. And then later on, he finds out about his actual death. All that kind of stuff. Denzel just conveys all of that about the character right from the jump without saying much of anything.
Oh, I love the intro because there's minimal dialogue, and you're just seeing the aftermath of the explosion. You're seeing Denzel going on the boats, like picking up people, or bodies, excavating evidence, or him just walking off to the shore to find the detonator pieces that just washed up. Like there's a lot being shown either through the direction or through Denzel's face, like the solemnness of like he's constantly for years trying to catch people who do these horrible acts of violence, and you just see it wearing down on him, and that it gives you so much to connect with him so quickly.
Yeah, and it's one of those like kind of movie star things as well, where the first time you see him and he is kind of doing all this stuff, this kind of like police work, you instantly buy it, and you're like, yeah, this guy is like a professional ATF agent. Like this is not Denzel Washington. This is like a real ATF agent. I don't know. There's something about him. It's so commanding, and it really works. And like, but he can do so much by giving you like no dialogue. But then like in that Jim Caviezel scene where he kind of goes a bit bigger, yeah, it just really, really works.
Or even like subtle indicators. Like I love the scene where, by the way, we mentioned him earlier, but shout out, two-time Cinema to the Letter appearer Bruce Greenwood, who we just talked about in iRobot, who pops up here. The whole scene where like he shuts everything down. It's just like, look, we got a confession out of him. It's all good. And Val Kilmer initially brings about like, well, maybe we should keep surveying the crime to see if there's anything else that can for the case. And Denzel has just the slightest amount of desperation in his voice about like, yeah, like keep getting evidence. We need a tight case. Like it shows a bit of vulnerability, but he's masking it behind like his sunglasses and that demeanor. And then Bruce Greenwood just calls him like, look, Agent Carly. And Denzel stops him just like, my name's Carlin. I'm not Carlin.
Oh, I love
Carlin.
Yes.
That he really cares about just like, no, don't mess up my fucking name, dude. If you're going to dress me down, actually say my fucking name right.
Yeah. But I think that's why I feel like at least Bruce Greenwood just being like in like 2 or 3 scenes, like just being there, like it's just enough of that type of FBI agent that I talked about earlier. Like he probably could have been an antagonist in a different draft, and I'm just glad that he's at least supportive enough and realize like, yeah, my job is done. You trying to do something else? Like I'm not dealing with this.
Look, an agent ended up dead. It's like, well, technically in either timeline that would have happened. Malcolm Oh my god. And and just another thing with Denzel, obviously we've kind of referenced a lot of the stuff in the climax, but his face as he's like submerged in that car and him realizing that he's like about to die and like save everybody is like so beautiful. It's such a perfect look on his face to sell that.
Yeah, what I love about this movie is the fact that like obviously it is this kind of Hitchcockian like trying to find this woman, right? This sort of perfect woman in his eyes. But what I love about kind of that is that it is, I guess by saving her, he is sort of not just saving everyone literally, but it is more what you guys were talking about earlier of like he wants to save someone before the crime has happened, and it just matters so much to him to save Paula Patton specifically. And I just think that is also just such a beautiful like thing in this movie, right? Where like they have a bit of like romance a little bit, right? Like when they kiss, like right as he's about to get on the boat, it is like absolutely like just phenomenal. But yeah, just the beauty of him just wanting to help and wanting to like save people, and in that moment getting like both of those things, getting to save Paula Patton but also getting to save the like 500 people. It's such a like weirdly beautiful thing for this movie that doesn't feel like it has a lot of that emotional core at all, but it really does, and it's what carries the entire movie.
Well, especially when there's a shittier version of this movie where he could just save Paula Patton and he doesn't need to go to the ferry. In a creepier version of this movie, it's like, I only cared about saving you.
Right.
That's all I cared about. But he still is determined about, like, we need to save everybody. It's like, I'm glad you're safe at this point, but we need to save more people. And he's even just like, look, I'm probably going to die on this ferry. So you go over and tell those officers about this, and I'll deal with stuff on the actual ferry. Implying that it's just like, well, you're safe, that's good. I'm not going to, like, stick around and fuck with either your life or also time itself by sticking around. I have to, like, close this loop, basically. And that she realizes just like, you know what? He's determined about this. I need to help him out and save these people as well. It really sells, like I said, that whole element of it, of him looking at this woman and like kind of like falling for her and wanting to save her, that is such a fucking tightrope to walk. I was very nervous about like, how is this gonna fucking go? And it pulls it off perfectly.
Yeah, I do agree. I was a bit scared going back that there could have been something that felt off. Like, I mean, there was a bit of me kind of being a little weirded out by the kiss because from Paula Patton's perspective, she met the guy like 3 hours ago, tops. But the thing is that they are so drawn, and his earnestness is what actually saves that whole connection. And I agree. Like there could have been your example of him just saving Paula Patton, but I could see a colder version of it being more like that he goes off to focus on the fairy and just leaves her. Like there's like so many types of stories like feels like love is not enough that we had to save the many over the few kind of thing, and I feel like it would have been just as inferior on that. But I feel like it they both connect the idea of the ATF agent who wanted to save so many lives from an explosion while also saving this unrelated woman that he's been watching and seeing like she had her own life. She was collateral damage in all this. So he feels that responsibility. And that's why I am glad at least that there was a part where Paula Patton went to the ferry, and even if she was temporarily captured, she still was involved with saving all those lives that she technically died with them, even if it wasn't at the same time.
Yeah, and also just what an amazing ending scene of this movie too.
Oh yeah,
of just like with that Beach Boys song, the "Don't Worry Baby" song, is like so perfectly utilized. Like at the top, and then at this ending here, where like the moment you hear it like come on the radio, you're like, oh no, everything's gonna fucking fall apart. And then utilizing it again is just like our happy ending moment. It's such a like perfect crowd pleasing ending moment of once again the deja vu. Just like what is that? Nah, it's fine. Anyway, let's get out of here, later. Don't worry, baby. Like yeah, fuck yeah.
Now I may realize that's probably where Nolan got the idea for the music as a cue in Inception. Also, the fact of a car going off of a bridge into water, like it's just
yeah.
It just. I'm not saying that he watches Tony Scott movies and copies from him. I'm just saying he's a fan.
That's true. Until he does his own remake of The Fan, then
oh man,
that'll be the tell.
That'd be really interesting, actually.
Well, you know, on that note, we've been talking for a while about Deja Vu. So, Yonathan, our guest, any final thoughts and musings about Tony Scott's Deja Vu?
I feel like sometimes that people forget about Deja Vu, even though it was a success in 2006. I do feel that it's a great window, literally, into a time that gives you ideas of how people viewed science, as well as ideas that can connect into a procedural story that is very relatable. I honestly think there isn't a bad person in this cast. I wish that Tony Scott get it now that he's gotten more of the recognition that is due. Like you should check this. People should be watching more of these, watching Deja Vu more often than not, because honestly, there's so much that we talked about that conceptually, just on the science fiction level, is just engaging. That I feel like there's far more stuff to just discuss among friends, just from that perspective, while also just having a fun cop drama involving a domestic terrorist. Like I feel like that this is a perfect marriage of the two ideas of a blockbuster that has all of the action that people expect, as well as things that you would actually learn more about. That I feel like now that we've gotten far more in the idea of like multiverses and all that stuff in blockbusters now, it just feels like it's just bland ideas of just, oh, what if people wore hats backwards or some nonsense, rather than actually exploring actual science and ideas of even though it is semi-fantasy, there's still ideas of fiction that are far more exploratory. And I feel like we're really missing out that we can't have more movies like this with the passing of Tony Scott, like actually like 6 years after this, like, or 2 years after Unstoppable. Like I feel like if we could have had something crazy, like now that Gladiator 2 is coming out, what if we had Deja Vu 2 or Man on Fire again? I don't know, like some crazy ideas of having like the Scotts together. It is an absolute miss if you haven't seen it, even though we've pretty much spoiled everything, I still feel like that it's one of my favorite Tony Scott movies, and I just want to share it with everyone.
I don't know if I ever would actually want a literal Deja Vu 2, but at the same time, the title Deja Vu 2 is too good to pass up.
Exactly.
That's kind of perfect as the sequel title. Or just Deja Vu, Deja Vu. You know,
Deja Vu again?
It'll just be... Deja Vu, did this happen already?
Well, they should just call it Deja Vu again. Deja Vu once more. And then it'll be like, wait, but we've already had Deja Vu. No, this is Deja Vu.
No, that's the full title. Just like Deja Vu. Wait, didn't we already have Deja Vu? Put that on the poster. Well, Bryan, your final thoughts on Deja Vu.
Yeah, I really love this movie. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And I will say, if, you know, I don't want a Deja Vu 2, since it obviously can't be made by Tony Scott, but I'll take a Tenet 2 and maybe get Denzel in there, you know? I don't know. I love this movie, and it gets better, you know, the more that I see it. I think it just really grows for me, and I love that it is this cop procedural, but also this action movie, but also it's about time travel, and it has these kind of lo-fi, you know, sci-fi elements, but it's also this weird Hitchcockian story, but in a way that is not really indebted to Hitchcock in terms of, like, it's stylistically, it's completely divorced from, like, Hitchcock, but it feels very modern, and it's still using a lot of those ideas from, like, Vertigo and stuff like that. And it's just such a great Denzel performance. I mean, is there such thing as a bad Denzel performance? I don't think so. But the entire supporting cast, like Paula Patton, is great. It's great to see Val Kilmer in this movie. Perfect role for Jim Caviezel. And yeah, just the way that Tony, you know, this movie should not work, right? Like, all those elements I mentioned, as well as, like, it being about surveillance and post 9/11 America and post Katrina New Orleans, and, you know, all of this stuff, it just should not work, you know, and all of that being filtered through this Tony Scott ultra stylish, frenetic style. It works perfectly, even though it absolutely shouldn't. It's a movie that it, like, should fall apart any minute, and it never does. I agree with you, Yonathan. It works as a blockbuster, but it works also as this kind of weird, thought-provoking, you know, science fiction film. And yeah, it is maybe my favorite Tony Scott movie, I will say. I mean, Crimson Tide maybe gives it a run for its money, but I just really adore this movie, and I just love that Tony Scott is getting more praise nowadays, you know, and he seems to be a very respected director now by a lot of film fans. Because I feel like when I was growing up, a lot of his movies were, like, just thought of as, like, trash and kind of, like, you know, blockbuster, like, garbage, right? And, like, we also didn't mention this, but, like, Disney made this movie. Like, Disney, like, Touchstone.
This is a Touchstone release.
Yeah,
Yes.
that is incredibly weird. And I know, Thomas, you and I have talked a lot about this, but, like, Disney doesn't make movies like this anymore. They just don't really care, as well as, like, it being a Jerry Bruckheimer production. Like, it's such an incredible movie, and I really love it. I hope that everyone sees it, because it's an incredible movie. And I hope one day to double feature it with Tenet, because I think that would be a really, really fun time.
It is kind of insane that, like, this is not just like the Jerry Bruckheimer of it all, but this is also the same year as the second Pirates of the Caribbean. So they're like, the Disney Bruckheimer thing is there, and Terry Rossio was one of the guys who, like, wrote on all three of those fucking movies. It feels like it's that great thing that, like, we do, I think, miss, where, like, Disney would only be interested now in just the Pirates of the Caribbean movie. It's like the one that costs over $100 million and should make $1 billion in theory, because you throw money at it, and that works, as opposed to, they wouldn't really make, like, a $75 million budgeted movie that ends up making 180. Like, tight profit, not, like, massive hit, but still just, like, justifies its existence with just enough profit to where it's like, yeah, that was a solid outing that doesn't end up creating sequels, doesn't end up, you know, building a cinematic universe of fucking across the Denzel-averse, where he meets Training Day Denzel, and then Heart Condition Denzel, everyone's favorite Denzel from Heart Condition.
And then Glory Denzel just being angry, like why am I here? Why are you here, old man? Like, there's a lot of dumb things that would have happened, but honestly, this could have been like a streaming movie if it came
Oh,
out now.
100%, yeah.
That's how I feel like.
And it would have looked
Yeah.
way worse, and it would have
It-
just been like so reduced in budget and everything. And like, yeah, it's exactly the kind of movie that we miss in Hollywood. But sorry, Thomas. Yeah, you were saying?
I'll just wrap up my final thoughts. I agree with everything you guys said, but I just want to really emphasize that as someone who went into this with just the basic knowledge, like, all right, this is like a time travel movie, I guess, and then watching, like we mentioned, that first half or so, and being like, when is the time travel going to get into here? It's like, oh, wait, digital projections? Oh, wait, these aren't digital projections. Window into the past, all this other stuff. This movie was just one of those rare experiences of seeing, because at this point, you know, I watched so many movies. If you follow my Letterboxd, you know how fucking weird I am and how many fucking movies I watch. It's so rare to see something especially I've never seen before, especially like not like a new movie that's getting hype or anything like that, just like an older movie, and really be just so fucking incredibly wowed by it. Especially like not even like an old movie, just like one from 2006. Like not a great era in theory for like a lot of, especially like these kind of movies. I was just kind of like worried going into this, like, oh, is this going to be kind of like good, maybe a bit forgettable or whatever, and just falling in love with the movie. Like I am Denzel and I'm watching, and this movie's my Paula Patton. I'm falling in fucking love with it, watching this whole fucking thing through, and I just want to watch it so many more times. I would say it's probably my second favorite Tony Scott at this point, and even in my top 5 Denzels, truly. I think it's like such a great use of Denzel's star charisma, such a great like example of Tony Scott's amazing ability to like just make an incredibly crowd-pleasing movie that has a lot of these like deeper contemplative themes, while not forgetting to just entertain an audience at the same time. Just truly, I think, an underrated gem in every sense of the word. Deja Vu. So yeah, even though, like Yonathan mentioned, we kind of spoiled the whole fucking movie, I'd still recommend just watching the shit out of this movie, because it fucking rules. I'm so glad that we picked this, and I'm so happy to discover this movie.
I'm glad this is my first episode with you guys. I'm just gonna stay away from egregious. Like I could just stop right now. It's a masterpiece.
If you asked Yonathan to come back on, he'd say, I won't try. I'm not going to bother. Well, on that note, let's get into our segment from every episode, Between the Lines. So every episode, Bryan, myself, and a guest, if we have one on, talk about a movie that, you know, is either related to the movie we're talking about today or could be an alternate choice for this particular, you know, episode's criteria of, say, M for masterpiece, hard sci-fi. And Bryan, you're going first here. What is your pick for Between the Lines?
Yeah, well, this kind of also very convenient because I got this Blu-ray recently with you, Thomas, actually. For a movie
We went Blu-ray shopping recently. We had a little Blu-ray shopping date.
Oh,
yeah, and I got this movie for
Aw,
I know
that's sweet.
It was very romantic. And I hadn't seen this movie in like maybe a decade, honestly. I'm recommending Looper, the Rian Johnson movie from 2012. Also another time travel movie, and also kind of feels a bit like a movie we don't get anymore in a way. I was a bit worried about Looper going back into it because I was worried to see would this hold up. Like, you know, I saw this movie a lot when it came out for some reason. I was really obsessed with it, and watching it again, I was really, really like satisfied by this movie. It's a really, really wonderful little time travel thriller, action thriller, which if anyone doesn't know for some reason, it stars Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who is a hitman who kills people who are sent from the future. As he says, time travel hasn't been invented yet, but in the near future it will be. And in the future, those criminals send back the people they want killed to him. He kills them, and, that's what happens. But there is, of course, the fact that he is sent back as Bruce Willis, and he has to kill him. He doesn't, and it sets off this chain of events. And I forgot how much of this movie is not only kind of creating this world full of like rules, which I really love. I just love lore and just kind of like all of that stuff, but also how much of this movie is about like a baby Hitler scenario, weirdly enough. And I really love this movie, and weirdly enough, I love Joseph Gordon-Levitt in it. I think Bruce Willis is really, really wonderful in it, and it is kind of one of the final Bruce Willis performances before, like, of course, he had like health problems, and that's kind of part of what gets him into that
before
rut.
the geezer teaser era that kind of affected his last few films. Yeah,
right. But it's a really great performance from him, and also Emily Blunt shows up in there as well, a younger Paul Dano as well. Jeff Daniels looking great. He's got like a long beard, and he's like tired and whatever. And it is such a just satisfying little movie that is so fun to watch. And it's so rewatchable, like I've seen this movie a few times, but watching it again, I didn't realize how much of it is so memorable and was still in my head. It's a really, really wonderful movie. And it's also weird to consider that this is the last movie that Rian Johnson made before he made a Star Wars, a movie that everyone was super normal about and continues to be to this day.
100%.
But yeah, it's a really, really wonderful movie. I recommend rewatching it. I feel like it's one of those movies that was really big at the time, but now has kind of faded a bit more into, not obscurity, but a bit more of like, hey, remember that movie? But yeah, Looper. I don't know. Have you guys watched this movie at all recently, or like, did you watch it when it came out? Like.
I definitely watched it in theaters, and I loved it so much that I rented it to show to my coworkers at a end of the year movie marathon. It's like, I love Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis in the movie. I honestly felt like this was the first time I realized Emily Blunt could actually like really act. Like, I mean, she was good in previous movies, but there was just something about like the scenes in the farm that I will always remember. She's just subtly talking about like how she was like, she's so gifted with her psychic powers that she would fool around with guys just trying to impress her, like, and all that. And then just having that crash all down when she mentions like she goes back to the farm to see her son, and she just sees how broken as a boy, and she realizes she has to be like a real mom. And that just builds up into that whole story of like, we hear about this mysterious rainmaker who's like people don't know where he came from or much about his past, but the bits and pieces we hear, like either like he got a glass jaw, he saw his mom die, and all that's like, it builds like similarly to Deja Vu as like a build up to what can you do to prevent a huge tragedy that's going to cause even more tragedies. And also just like that Bruce Willis just like doesn't want to sit down and talk about time travel. He's like, dude, we like it's a good one.
Yeah, I think it's a real testament to Rian Johnson as a filmmaker that I think this movie's pretty great, and I would also say it's probably my least favorite of his movies, which might be a hot take. I'm not sure.
That's a little hot.
Perhaps. Ooh, it's a bit hot at the end. Even though I said the movie was great before that, guys. I emphasize that much. I think if anything, my biggest problem with it is I really don't think we need Joseph Gordon-Levitt's prosthetics, guys. I think that kind of hampers his performance, and I just think like it'd be much easier to trust the audiences to say that like, oh, normal Joseph Gordon-Levitt is just younger Bruce Willis. I think we get it. Like, I don't really, I think that's like kind of like a not a fatal flaw, but a massive flaw that I think keeps the movie from being amazing to me necessarily. It might sound minor, but I think it's a bit more crucial to like him as our lead and everything else. But regardless, I think everything else about that movie is pretty great. I agree with you. I think the 1-2 punch of this and Moonrise Kingdom in 2012 was like such a great kind of like back-to-back Bruce Willis like comeback of a bit.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, both of them were around the same time. And I agree, like Emily Blunt's pretty great. Jeff Daniels rules. Probably my favorite Noah Segan in one of Johnson's movies. He always pops up. He's the Lucky Charm, but he's like great. He's like a sniveling asshole, particularly the way that he's like on that hover thing, the hover motorcycle, and he keeps like fucking it up. It's like such a good running gag for that movie. Yeah, I think a great movie for sure. But I think just once again a testament to Johnson that this great movie isn't quite at the stature with his other even better movies to me. But in any case, I'm going to go ahead and speaking of Jeff Daniels, Brian, my movie today stars Jeff Daniels, and I wanted to, with this particular one, I wanted to try and find a time travel movie. And I also wanted to represent the 90s, because with our schedule for this season, it's the one decade that's kind of shut out, and from especially like the later part of the 20th century, the 20th into the 21st century. We didn't have a 90s movie on here, so I wanted to find an interesting 90s movie, and I found one that's pretty obscure. It's a movie that was originally released as Timescape in 1992, but now goes under usually the title The Grand Tour, which for the record, I think neither are great titles, but I think The Grand Tour is a much worse one. And it's a shame that it's kind of put under that, because the basic premise of it is Jeff Daniels plays this guy who is a recent widower after an accident that we see kind of clips of involving his wife and him in a car accident where they hit a horse that starts like bucking at the window while they're both like in the car. It's really upsetting and brutal. He is a single dad now with his daughter played by Ariana Richards, 1 year before Jurassic Park, where she played the young girl. Yes.
Oh, my.
Right. And they've recently, after the death of the mother, they've gone back Jeff Daniels' hometown, his little small hometown, to renovate this guest house that they're going to turn into an inn. And while they're like fixing things up, there's a lot of conflict, particularly like the neighborhood priest, the neighborhood reverend who was the father of the deceased wife of Jeff Daniels, and there's a lot of conflict there. But while they're fixing up this inn, and it hasn't officially opened yet, a group of strangers show up. They seem very odd. They seem maybe out of time, perhaps. And Jeff Daniels starts noticing, like, when they come up to him and are just like, oh, can we get some rooms at the inn? And he's just like, well, we haven't really renovated anything yet. I don't know if that's we're not really finished. You can come back maybe in a couple of weeks. He says at one point, like, well, you go to the hotel that's in like the normal part of town. They're like, no, we can't go into that part of town. We're not going to go into the main town. We have to stay up here, because they're in a slightly up on like a hill and all this stuff. And he starts noticing some weird things, like one of the guys drops their passports, and there's all these dates on here for specific weird dates, like from 1906, and all these dates match up to certain real life disasters. And basically, it turns out these guys are time travelers who do basically like tourism for horrible disasters that have happened throughout history. And I'm going to stop there, because that's kind of like the basic premise of this, but the sci-fi conceits that this movie goes on from here are kind of fascinating. There's even a bit of like, the Deja Vu connection of like, that I didn't even intentionally do because I didn't know much about this movie, about like they're basically rubbernecking for disasters or time traveling specific points. And as the movie explores some more of the time travel elements of it, it gets like more and more interesting on a creative level. This is directed and written by David Twohy. It's his directorial debut. Most people might know him as of recent for making like the Riddick movies, like Pitch Black and Chronicles of Riddick. Sure. And this is before, this was around the time he was still just a screenwriter doing stuff like The Fugitive and Critters 2, The Main Course. Very similar films. And it's a really interesting movie that, admittingly, the aesthetic of it looks a lot like a 90s era sort of pilot for a TV show. Like, it's got Quantum Leap vibes in terms of like the way that it's sort of filmed. It's kind of like, it's a bit low rent on that level, but it has a lot of interesting sci-fi ideas. I think the cast is all amazing, particularly obviously Jeff Daniels, one of our most reliable actors out there. Just like really encompassing a lot of like the tragedy that's coming from, like just what happened in his recent past, and also trying to care for his daughter. They have a really great chemistry, him and Ariana Richards. There's a whole recurring bit of, like, she has to remember dates for school, so he has flashcards, and is bringing up just like, what about this date? It's like, that's the date the stock market crashed. What about this date? I don't know. It's my birthday. You should know that one. Like, stuff like that. Just, like, a really fun and sweet, but then once, like, the time travel stuff gets into it, like, him kind of investigating on, like, a very everyman level, it's really engrossing. And, yeah, it's a very forgotten movie that I'm glad I discovered, and I hope more people do. I'm gonna guess both of you have no idea what the fuck this was before I brought it up.
Oh, no.
Does it sound intriguing to you all, though?
I tried searching for it just to see it, and it turns out there's another movie with the same name that's also a time travel movie that came out 2 years ago, Following Two Kids. I'm not sure if it's like a remake that twists some things, but it doesn't look good. But I'll check out Timescape / The Grand Tour.
Yeah, I had not heard of this, and it's weird that it's the director of like the Riddick movies, and the fact that he wrote The Fugitive as well is weird. But also, apparently David Twohy has a writing credit on that movie that our guest last week, Adam, recommended, Imposter.
Yes, Impostor, right. Another
so weird.
incredibly obscure movie. Twohy got around, man. Wrote a lot of shit. He was a working screenwriter in the 90s in particular. But yeah, so Yonathan, what's your recommendation?
I recommend the 2011 film Source Code, directed by Duncan Jones. Taking the idea of Deja Vu, of Jake Gyllenhaal is trying to prevent a second terrorist attack by reliving the first attack inside someone else's body, and only going through for the last 8 minutes of the actual event up to the explosion. What really drew me to this idea was that the fact of the same themes of connecting with someone, even if they are some sort of recreation through quantum mechanics and connections to synapses and all that. Like, there's a lot of scientific explanations on how this device works while having layers on twists that I feel like I just don't want to keep spoiling if you haven't seen it, because it feels like it also got buried. But I feel like that Gyllenhaal's actual earnestness of trying to help people while also really screwing up, because like there are instances of xenophobia and other just things, because what we're seeing from this perspective is that Gyllenhaal first wakes up on the train, and then he learns that he's been in this program for months, and he's slowly trying to understand what happened after his tour in Afghanistan. And there's just twists and turns on just realizing what is the situation that he's in, while also just revealing this whole idea of a system of trying to prevent future dangers, leading to possibilities of other worlds, timelines, while also being critical of the military-industrial complex. Because we first see, like, because of the rest of the cast, Vera Farmiga and Jeffrey Wright are part of the Source Code project, and it really is like focusing on trying to stop terrorism while also trying to get more people like Gyllenhaal to go through these processes. Like, I know, I feel like that there are some parts that do have some of the faults that you would expect from Deja Vu, but I do feel as if it's still a really tight movie with a lot of interesting ways of trying to use the time loop conceit as actually something far just as interesting as procedural, as if the detective is learning as he goes. And I feel like it's definitely a fun little watch. You can definitely check it out. I guess at the time of this recording, it was on Hulu. I'm not sure if it's rentable right now, but it's definitely one that I feel like could also be paired with Deja Vu as a double feature.
Yeah, I like Source Code. I wish I loved Source Code. I think maybe watching Deja Vu kind of even underlined some of the issues I remember having about Source Code. Particularly, I'll just say this much without spoiling it. I agree that I don't want to spoil it for anybody necessarily. The key example of a movie that I wish ended like 3 minutes before it ended. I'm not a huge fan of the coda of that movie in particular. which I think kind of like crumbles a lot of the interesting stuff that it's kind of building up to with what I think works as an ending for that movie. But at the same time, I do agree it's very fun. I think it's a great use of Gyllenhaal, Michelle Monaghan, and Vera Farmiga. But my favorite, I think this was the movie when I was younger where I fell in love with Jeffrey Wright. Especially that dude in that movie has to deliver so much sci-fi gobbledygook and does it with such conviction. Thinking of like all the possibilities when someone asks like, well, how do you explain all this? It's like, well, you see, if we do it like this and then this over here, and just in the Jeffrey Wright way, just like, yeah, this motherfucker can deliver just expositional garbage so well. Fuck yeah, love this dude. So if nothing else, it's definitely instrumental for that. But yeah, definitely it's a solid fun watch. I would say the kind of like the B attached movie to the masterwork of Deja Vu. But have you seen this one, Brian?
I did. I saw it in theaters with my dad, and I'll be honest, I don't remember a single thing about it. To where, Yonathan, when you were describing it, I honestly had no idea what you were talking about because I was like, "That does happen in that movie." Like I haven't seen it since in theaters, but I have been wanting to revisit it for some weird reason. I think I'm really fascinated by Duncan Jones's career, of course, as the son of, David Bowie, but he has a really fascinating and weird career, and I've wanted to revisit a few of his movies, but I really don't remember that much about Source Code. I remember liking it when I saw it in theaters. I think my dad liked it as well, so, thumbs up from him.
Just to underline what Brian's talking about, though, like with Duncan Jones, starts with Moon, a great movie that we almost contemplated doing for this particular episode, honestly, because I think it would kind of fit.
That's true, yeah.
For this. Then Source Code, then Warcraft.
Yeah.
Which, just completely torpedoed him for a bit. Then the movie Mute, which is another kind of hard sci-fi, but is horrible. And also notable because it's very bad. Also, it's a real indicator of Source Code to Mute really shows you the whole kind of de-evolution of the film industry, where he goes from a solid mid-budget sci-fi actioner that's released in theaters to Mute, a very poor looking Netflix movie that is just kind of disastrous. And he is making a new movie. I just was looking up. He's doing an adaptation of the comic Rogue Trooper, which is going to be an animated movie animated with the Unreal Engine.
Oh, very okay.
Yeah, for video games and shit. That's wild. I just found out this existed, and it's finished filming, so it's actually coming out.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay, that actually. I'm flabbergasted. I'm sorry. It's just the idea of making a movie with the Unreal Engine. Okay, I'm thinking video game cutscenes, not fully rendered animated film. But okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious of that because he has not had a great career. I fucking own a copy of Warcraft on Blu-ray that I have been scared for years to revisit because I remember that movie not being that great. But
speaking of Paula Patton too. Poor Paula.
Oh my God, you're right.
God, Mute is a bad movie. I cannot hate him for that movie because I know that it was dedicated to his dad, and it was he was going through a very tough time around those years. So I as bad as Mute is, I can't really hold any ill will to him for that. But
well, I mean, especially when your dad dies at the beginning of 2016, and then you make Warcraft.
Right,
that's a bad year.
yeah.
God.
But I'm curious. I don't know. I'm morbidly curious about that movie in a weird way.
Well, on that note, let's repeat our titles for everybody in case you want to, add these to your watch list out there, Brian.
I had the 2012 film from Rian Johnson, Looper.
And I had the 1992 film from David Twohy, Timescape, a.k.a. The Grand Tour.
And I picked the 2011 Duncan Jones film, Source Code.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up here, but we want to thank some people as we head on out. We want to thank Burial Grid for our music. Purchase this music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork finder at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks, of course, to our loyal Patreon supporters, patreon.com/cinema2, where for just $1 a month, you all get access to, bonus stuff that we record and put out there, like audio reviews. We would have put out probably recently our little audio review about Trap, the M. Night Shyamalan movie, and also our big one that we do every month. We at least have one bigger kind of bonus podcast. We'll be doing an audio commentary for The Iron Giant in honor of its 25th anniversary. Bryan and I will talk over that and have some fun. And I look forward to us also talking about Alien Romulus amongst the audio review stuff. Yeah, it really, if you become a Cineast patron, it helps out the show a lot. It supports the main feed, allows us to do fun stuff over there, like hours of entertainment you can listen to if you're a Cineast patron. Like our guest, Yonathan. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yes, thank you.
Really appreciate it, for sure. And
I
thanks for
appreciate
the support as well on the Patreon.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. I've been a patron for even back when we were edgelords. So yeah.
Yes.
It's definitely recommend. Definitely there's a lot of great content that you guys do. Like I do like the reviews, especially for movies that I'm kind of hesitant on seeing. Like at least getting your 2 cents does sway me to check out those that I've been on the fence for like a second, but definitely worth the dollar.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Do you have anything to plug?
Oh, yes. So I am on Letterboxd. I do sometimes put a little reviews with my ratings. You can catch me at black_Gendo. Black as you spell it as usual. Gendo, Gendo. And I sometimes lurk through Blue Sky with the same handle. I'll definitely at least retweet this, and maybe if you want to follow me, I'll actually have more incentive on being on Blue Sky. I'm to forget about Twitter. It's a sinking ship.
You couldn't quite forget about it to call reposting on Blue Sky retweeting. Yeah, on the phone.
Oh no.
You can't quit an old flame like
it's in my
Twitter.
blood. No.
You can follow us on, Twitter or Blue Sky, whatever hell site you're on, at cinema2letter. If we're on that social, we're at that particular handle, cinema2letter. And you can find me on Letterboxd as at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at film-cred.com. And just a shout out, we're in the middle of August when this is coming out. I'm going to be at Dragon Con again, if everything goes well. So I should be doing that all Labor Day weekend over in the Atlanta, Georgia area. If you're at Dragon Con, look up the Dragon Con app, and you can find all of the different ones I'm at. You can just look at my under my presenter page. I'll probably at the next episode have some kind of insert about my specific schedule, as I'll be finalized by that time. But look forward to me there if you're in the Atlanta area on Labor Day weekend.
Yeah, and you can follow me on Twitter if you really want to. I'm not on it that much anymore, but you never know. I might go back. At BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd at my name, where I actually use that website. Follow me on either of those.
And for more of us, in terms of audio, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts at, whatever platform you use. If you're listening on our great network, Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on there? And you can dig into the archives in our Podbean main feed for, the first 5 seasons of this show, as well as all the old double-edged double bill stuff. Jonathan's in a couple of those episodes. You can scrounge around for those. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, it's cool. Money can be tight. The free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility so you can look at us like a voyeur. Well, on that note, we should tease that our next episode, our season finale already, Bryan, for Hard Sci-Fi, we're wrapping it up next time with our A for Atypical choice, where we are covering from 1984, Starman, the John Carpenter film starring Jeff Bridges. Jonathan, are you at all familiar with Starman?
I'm familiar with it. It has been one that I've only seen parts of. I really should go back to it. It's something about those early 80s sci-fi films that I kind of just overlooked in my youth, that I feel like it should be something to explore. So I'll definitely check it out before I listen to the episode.
Yeah, we're very curious to talk about this one, Bryan, because it definitely fits as like A for Atypical. for hard sci-fi for a lot of reasons. It's been more of a romance. It's atypical for John Carpenter. It's atypical that Jeff Bridges managed to get a fucking Oscar nomination for this movie. It's so interesting.
Right? Yeah.
It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to rewatch it though, because I've only seen it once, where I was I kind of viewed it as the like, oh, is this the John Carpenter movie that kind of like doesn't exist? But no, it is a really beautiful and sweet movie that kind of makes me tear up. So I'm really excited to rewatch it, and it's always a good day when you get to watch and talk about a John Carpenter movie.
No, that's true.
Yeah, for sure. Especially one that doesn't have a score from him also, and is just like, it's so weird, but it's a great movie. I'm excited to wrap up the season by talking about that particular one. But it's time we wrap up here on this particular episode. And on that note, if you ask me how hard it is to particularly end an episode, like what I would do to end an episode in such a like very drastic way, like what would I do? I'd try. That's what I'd do.